Hey guys, tonight we wander deep into the remote hills of Japan, where a forgotten inn still clings to the mountainside like a memory that refuses to fade. Mist wraps around its old timber beams, its stone lanterns glow faintly under a moonless sky, and if you listen closely, you might hear the shoji doors slide open, even though no one is there to greet you. This is not just any haunted place. It's one where silence thickens like smoke and time folds in on itself. And tonight, you are the last guest. You probably won't survive this one, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The bus dropped her off at the base of a dirt path, barely wider than a bicycle tire. Hana stood alone in the still afternoon air, her suitcase tilting slightly as it rested against the cracked stone milestone that marked the beginning of Yamashiro Pass. She checked her phone. No signal, just a single blinking bar that faded whenever she moved. There was no road sign, no village in sight, only the suggestion of a trail disappearing into a tangle of trees whose tops blurred with the drifting fog. She exhaled. The driver hadn't spoken when she boarded, hadn't spoken when she'd paid. He had only glanced at her ticket and nodded once, slowly, before turning his eyes back to the road with a solemn heaviness that felt more like a warning than courtesy. The wind stirred behind her, scattering a few brittle leaves across the moss-covered stones. Hana adjusted the strap on her shoulder and stepped forward. It had been her grandmother's idea months ago before she passed. "Go to Yamashiro," she had whispered from the hospital bed, her voice papery. "The inn is still there. It's waiting, waiting." She hadn't understood then, but now the word followed her like a breathless companion. The trail climbed sharply, winding between ancient cedar trees and bamboo stalks that hissed against each other when the wind whispered low. At some point, the sun slipped behind the mountain, and the light dimmed to a bluish wash. Just as her legs began to tremble with exhaustion, the path leveled out, and she saw it, the Yamashiro Inn. It wasn't grand. Not anymore. The roof tiles sagged. Moss blanketed the low stone walls, and the gate leaned slightly to one side. But it still stood with a kind of quiet dignity, like an elder who had outlived everyone else and found peace in solitude. She pushed the gate open. It didn't creak. It sighed. Inside the garden had overgrown, but not wildly. The stepping stones were still visible, winding between weeping cherry trees that hung their blossoms like drapes. At the center stood a koi pond, so still it reflected the gray sky, perfectly broken only by the occasional ripple, as if something unseen moved just beneath the surface. The front door was unlocked. She stepped inside. The air was cooler than outside, filled with the scent of cedarwood tatami and a trace of incense so faint it might have just been memory. A bell above the door gave a soft chime, not metal, but a wooden con-con-like knocking. No one came to greet her. "Hello," she called out. No answer. She moved slowly through the entryway, slipping off her shoes and placing them beside the others, already neatly lined against the wall, 4 pairs. All worn, none hers. At the end of the narrow hall stood a desk, and behind it a key rack, with only one key remaining. Room key 7. Her hand hovered over it for a moment before she took it. A small paper note fluttered out from between the keys, landing face down on the floor. She turned it over. "Please do not open the window at night." That was all it said. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way to her room. The inn was silent, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, as if it's listening just as closely as you are. Room 7 was at the very end of the second-floor corridor. When she slid the shoji screen open, she was surprised to find the room, pristine futons, folded cushions, aligned a kettle still warm on the table, as if someone had just left. She sat in front of the window, careful not to open it. and stared out at the trees, swaying gently in the growing dusk. Something stirred deep in the garden below, just a flicker of movement. A woman in white stepped between the trees, her face turned away, her long hair hanging over one shoulder. Then she vanished behind the wall. Hana blinked, waited. No one came out the other side. She looked down at the key still in her hand. On its tag, faint but visible, something had been etched with a dull blade. "You are not the first." The night crept in, and Yamashiro Inn held its breath. The first night at Yamashiro Inn was heavier than sleep. Hana lay beneath the futon, its weight unfamiliar but comforting, listening to the silence that never quite stayed still. It wasn't oppressive, it was watchful, like the quiet that settles over a shrine after prayers have been spoken. The paper walls did little to block sound, but none came. No footsteps from the hall, no floorboard creaks, no insects outside. Just the occasional sigh of wind brushing across the roof tiles like fingers remembering their way. She turned onto her side and stared at the window. "Don't open it." The note's words drifted through her mind, half lullaby, half warning. She didn't. By morning, she had almost convinced herself that the woman in white she'd seen in the garden had been a trick of the mist. The trees swayed gently in the breeze again. The koi pond glistened under the muted light, and birdsong returned in short, tentative chirps. Yamashiro Inn in the clarity of day seemed almost ordinary. Breakfast had been left in a lacquered bento box outside her door, still warm. No knock, no footsteps leading away. Hana crouched, inspected the corridor still empty, and brought the meal inside. Grilled fish, pickled plum rice, and a perfectly peeled slice of persimmon. A handwritten note tucked beneath the chopsticks read, "Welcome, Miss Hana. Please enjoy your stay." No signature, no mention of the innkeeper. She explored the inn that morning, stepping quietly through the main halls. Scroll paintings still hung in alcoves, faded but well cared for. Tatami floors bore impressions of weight that seemed too fresh to be decades old. Dust only gathered in the corners as if the place maintained itself, or was maintained by someone who chose not to be seen. One room near the garden stood locked. A small wooden placard hung from the handle. "Subobuka no lodging." She moved on. The bathhouse at the rear of the inn had water already drawn. The surface steamed gently, and the scent of hinoki cedar drifted from the wooden tubs like memory. A single towel sat folded on the stone bench beside a comb and mirror. Hana paused. Someone had used the comb recently. Long black hairs curled between its teeth caught there like threads. She didn't touch them. That night, she returned to room 7 early, the key always in her pocket. The sun dipped low and the light took on that amber hue that made everything feel just a little older. She sat again at the window, watching the sky fold into itself, and then she saw it again, the woman. This time the figure was facing her, too far away to make out details, but Hana could feel the woman watching. There was no malice in it, only longing and stillness, as if she'd been standing there for far too long. Then, just as before, the woman turned and disappeared behind the garden wall. This time Hana followed. She took her key, and Flashlight wrapped herself in a shawl and slipped through the side door. The air outside was cooler than expected. Her steps were soft, the moss beneath her sandals muffling the sound. The garden looked different at night, deeper. The path seemed to stretch longer than it had earlier, and the trees leaned in closer to listen. She reached the wall where the woman had vanished, but there was nothing behind it. No door, no break in the hedge, just stone and brush. Then her flashlight flickered, once, twice, and then it went out. In the sudden darkness she heard it. Not a voice, a breath, long and trembling, inhaled right behind her ear. She spun around, nothing. She ran back inside her breath, fogging in the hallway despite the warmth of the inn. When she entered room 7, her window was open. She was sure she hadn't touched it. The futon was unrolled. A A single wet footprint stained the tatami beside it, narrow, bare, and facing the door. Something had come in, or had never left. Hana didn't sleep that night. She sat with her back against the far wall, her knees pulled close, watching the open window, until the sky paled into gray. The single footprint slowly dried, leaving only a faint, darker smudge on the tatami. She never saw who left it, or what. But the air never warmed again after she returned to the room. It hung cold and damp like fog trapped in a bottle. The scent of old water lingered, too faint, but unmistakable. Not the clean mineral tang of the bathhouse. This was deeper, older, and faintly sweet, like a well that hadn't seen sunlight in years. She finally closed the window at dawn, latching it with trembling hands, then stood by it for a long moment listening. Nothing stirred, no breath behind her, no footfalls in the hall, just her own heartbeat, slow and strangely calm, as though part of her had already accepted something the rest of her hadn't caught up to yet. When she stepped into the corridor, the air felt heavier, not oppressive, but weighted, like the atmosphere was holding its breath. The bento box that morning held miso soup, pickled burdock, and tamagoyaki, still warm. The note was different this time. Room 7 is not meant for long stays. There was no signature again. Hana placed the tray gently on the floor. She didn't eat. Instead, she made her way back to the front desk, hoping to find someone, anyone. The lobby was still deserted. She called out. Her voice felt swallowed by the wood, absorbed into the quiet. Behind the desk, the key rack now held no keys. All gone. Even room 7's hook was empty. Her key was still in her pocket. She removed it and held it up against the label. The numbers matched, but something was off. The metal was darker, tarnished as though it had aged a decade overnight. She turned to go, but her eye caught movement, barely a flicker in the mirror behind the counter. She froze. In the reflection, a figure stood at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the corner. Motionless, barefoot, dressed in white. Her hair was long, unmoving, and her face was hidden beneath strands that draped like wet silk. Hana spun around. Nothing was there, but the mirror still showed her. The figure hadn't moved. She left the lobby without looking back. Later in the garden, she found the koi pond still and glassy. No ripples, no movement beneath the surface. It was as if the fish had vanished. She leaned over the water, peering into its reflection. Her own face stared back at her, but it was faintly wrong. Not in expression, but in delay. When she blinked, the reflection followed a second too late. When she tilted her head, the mirrored version hesitated, then caught up. She leaned closer. Behind her own mirrored shoulder, just faintly stood the woman in white, watching. Hana turned quickly. Again, nothing. She was beginning to feel like the inn was teaching her something. Not scaring her, but unspooling something inside her mind thread by thread. The fear she felt was cold and deep, but it was no longer sharp. It was the kind of dread that came from familiarity, from recognizing a shadow you thought you'd left behind in childhood. That night, she found a folded scrap of paper on her pillow. It hadn't been there that morning. No one had entered the room since she had. The paper was old, its edges yellowed and slightly curled. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was precise, but shakily written, as if each stroke had taken effort. If she watches you 3 nights in a row, she remembers you. If she remembers you, she may follow you home. No signature, no explanation, just that. She didn't sleep again. She sat awake through the long hours of night, staring at the window, its latch still firmly shut. Her reflection in the dark glass stared back, warped slightly, by the night beyond. The garden was motionless. The inn made no sound. Until sometime near dawn, she heard the soft creak of the hallway floor, a single step, then another. They stopped outside her room, A pause, and then nothing. But when Hana checked the door, the floor was wet just beyond the threshold. Not soaked, just damp, as if someone had passed through carrying the rain with them. The scent of the well was stronger now, not in the air, but in her room. By the fourth morning, Hana's sense of time had started to fracture. The clocks in the inn had no batteries. Her phone remained dead, its screen lifeless no matter how long she left it plugged into the wall. Sunlight was unreliable, slipping in and out of the clouds, like it too had grown wary of this place. She only knew it was morning because breakfast appeared again, gently placed outside her door, warm as always. This time, it was rice porridge with scallions, a single umeboshi, and a cup of green tea. No note accompanied it. She didn't eat. Her appetite had vanished with the koi. Instead, she wandered again. Not aimlessly, but drawn. The corridor near the locked room seemed darker, longer somehow. She counted the steps between the lantern sconces and found the number inconsistent, sometimes 6, sometimes 9. The shadows pooled near the Subobuka room, now not creeping, but settled like something had claimed that space and was content to remain unseen. She pressed her ear to the door. Silence. But not empty silence, held silence like a breath waiting to be exhaled. She stepped back. That afternoon, she found a forgotten stairwell behind a sliding panel in the far hallway, half covered by an old tapestry depicting a crane with bleeding feathers. The wood behind it was newer than the rest of the building, not yet bowed by time. She descended carefully. The air grew colder with each step. The stairwell led not to a basement, but to a narrow corridor lined with rooms. Rooms without numbers. The doors had no handles. Some had small viewing slits barred shut. One had paper talismans pressed against the frame, curling and faded with inked kanji that bled like bruises. She paused before the last door. Her name was written there, not in paint, not in ink, but carved, faintly etched into the wood. Hana. She reached out, fingertips barely brushing the grain, and the door groaned open by itself. The room beyond was empty. No furnishings, no futon, just tatami, a bare alcove, and a single low table upon which sat a black lacquer box. She crossed the threshold slowly, not breathing the quiet so intense it rang in her ears. The box had no lock. She opened it. Inside lay a comb, the same comb she had seen in the bathhouse, still threaded with long black hairs, and beneath it, folded with ceremonial precision, was a silk ribbon, the same deep indigo her grandmother used to wear in her hair. She hadn't brought it here. It had been buried with her. Suddenly a gust of wind burst through the hallway behind her. She spun around. The door had closed. The light dimmed. Then she heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing, but brushing. The soft, rhythmic pull of a comb through wet hair coming from the corner of the room where no one stood. It continued slow and deliberate, dragging through knots over and over again. Hana whispered Obachan. The combing stopped, and in the silence that followed, a voice not her grandmother's spoke just behind her ear. She took her shape. That's how she enters. Hana turned, heart thudding. No one was there, but the box had closed itself. When she reached for the door again, it opened easily, as if it had never closed. She fled, the hidden wing heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and recognition. The inn didn't resist her, but neither did it let her go. It was as if she'd passed through something unseen, a threshold with no door, a memory, not her own. Back in her room, the window was open again. Only this time the air wasn't cold. It was warm, wet, heavy with the scent of stagnant water and withered flowers like offerings left too long at a forgotten altar. On the windowsill sat a new note, written in a different hand. You let her in long ago. She looked toward the garden. The trees didn't sway anymore. The wind was gone. The koi pond was now completely black, reflecting nothing. Something had surfaced, and it was watching. That night, sleep came not as rest, but as surrender. Hana slipped into it like a swimmer slipping beneath dark water, the transition seamless, weightless, and thick. She dreamed, at least she thought it was dreaming, but it felt more like memory seen through someone else's eyes. The inn was older in the vision, the wood, fresher lacquered lanterns lit with warm candlelight. Laughter echoed from a distant banquet hall. Women in floral kimonos shuffled down corridors. Servers carried trays with delicate porcelain bowls, and in the center of it all, a girl stood barefoot in the main hall. Hair-wet eyes, downcast hands folded in front of her like a ghost, already practicing its stillness. No one spoke to her. No one saw her. She walked through their celebration like smoke, untouched and unacknowledged. The dream shifted, shadows lengthened, guests vanished. The tatami curled like leaves drying in heat, and the girl turned her face toward Hana. Only it wasn't a girl anymore. Her eyes were hollow, the skin around them rippling like water disturbed by a sudden wind. Her mouth opened, but no sound came, just the scent of rotting blossoms and cold stone. Hana jerked awake. The futon was soaked, not just damp, saturated. Her clothes clung to her hair heavy. But the room wasn't cold. It was humid, like she'd been sleeping inside the belly of a well. She sat up, hands trembling, and realized the water hadn't come from her. The futon was dry beneath her until she moved. And then from where her back had rested, water pooled outward in a widening stain, seeping slowly into the floor. There was no source, no trail. She backed away, heart hammering. From the hallway a sound rose, bare feet on wood, a single step, then another, steady, coming closer. She grabbed the key and rushed to the door, but stopped herself from opening it. Instead, she crouched eye to the gap near the floor. A shadow passed. No feet, no body, just darkness that walked like a person. The steps continued down the corridor and faded. When she opened the door, the hall was empty. But something had been left in front of room 7. A doll, small, handmade, straw-stuffed kimono-clad, its head-bowed arms stitched across its chest. A tiny tag dangled from one wrist, scrawled with one word in red ink, regret. She didn't touch it. Instead, she made her way back to the locked room at the far end of the hall. The Subo Buke plaque hung askew. The air around the door was warmer than before. Not hot, but human. Like someone had stood pressed against it for hours, leaving breath and body heat soaked into the wood. She touched the knob. It turned. The door opened with a breathless ease, revealing a room untouched by time. The futon was laid out. A vanity stood against the wall, its mirror veiled in black cloth. On the table, a meal ancient petrified in its dishes. Fish long since decayed, rice hardened to stone. Cobwebs reached from corner to corner like fingers that had waited too long, but it was the scent that made her recoil, the smell of sealed things, of grief, of something drowned but never buried. And then she noticed the writing on the far wall, scratched deep into the plaster, over and over, covering the entire surface like a mantra carved in desperation. Don't let her wear your face. Her breath caught. From the corner, a soft sound, the rustle of silk. Hana turned slowly, eyes straining against the dimness, and there she was, not behind her, inside the mirror. The veil had slipped. The woman stood within, staring back, but her movements were wrong, delayed, stiff. Her arms moved after Hana's did. Her eyes blinked at the wrong time. But the face was hers, pale, calm, but hollow. It smiled. Hana stumbled backward, and the mirror cracked, just slightly splitting the reflection along her right cheek like a thin scar. She fled the room and closed the door behind her, her breath catching in her throat. The plaque had fallen to the floor. She didn't pick it up. That night she tried again not to sleep. But in Yamashiro Inn, night has its own hunger, and sleep isn't always yours to control. Sleep took Hana like a tide, pulling beneath the surface, steady and irresistible. She tried to resist pacing the room, lighting the lantern, pouring cold water over her wrists. But the air had thickened, drugged with unseen fragrance, the scent of wet wood and wilted camellias. When she finally collapsed onto the futon, it wasn't from exhaustion alone. It was as though the inn itself had decided she was ready. In the dream, or the place that pretended to be a dream, she stood again at the edge of the koi pond. Except it wasn't still this time. It was black and churning surface broken by silent ripples. No fish moved beneath. Only strands of hair, long and flowing, coiling like water grass. Then the surface parted, and a hand rose, pale, dripping fingers stretched toward her own reflection. Not to grab, not to pull, just to point. Behind her, she turned. The inn stood twisted, melted by time lanterns flickering like candlelight in windless air. On the balcony, a procession of women in white stood motionless, hair over faces, silent, each one identical, and at the center, one missing a face altogether. No features, just smooth skin unmarred, waiting. Her head tilted toward Hana, sensing rather than seeing her. A breathless noise filled the air. Not a scream, not a whisper, the sound of memory shattering. Hana woke, gasping. The futon was dry, but the mirror in her room she hadn't remembered there being a mirror was uncovered now, and cracked. A fine line ran diagonally from top corner to the base like the trace of a single nail drawn across its surface, and in its reflection her own image moved differently, just like before. A half second behind eyes, too steady smile, too calm. She covered it with a towel. At breakfast, a note had returned with the meal. "You're remembering too quickly." She hadn't remembered anything, had she? After eating, somehow unable to resist the soft rice and broth this time, she stepped into the garden again. The cherry trees had begun to wither, though it wasn't the season. Their blossoms drooped like mourning veils, petals brown at the edges. The koi pond, once glassy and pristine, now reflected nothing. She leaned over again, heart thudding, and saw something different. Her grandmother, standing in the water, not floating, not submerged, standing, hair bound with the indigo ribbon, smiling faintly, but not the way she used to. The smile wasn't hers, Oba-chan, Hana whispered again, throat dry. The woman blinked, and her face shifted. First to her grandmother's, then to her own, then to something in between, familiar, but wrong. The lips moved, but the reflection made no sound. Only the ripple of the water spoke concentric circles, distorting her face until she looked like no one at all. Behind her, a branch snapped. She turned sharply. A child stood near the hedges. A little girl in a red yukata, faded and torn, holding a broken fan. She looked up, her eyes dull but curious. "You came back," the girl said. "I've never been here before," Hana replied, uncertain. The girl shook her head. "You always say that." Before Hana could respond, the girl turned and walked away, disappearing not around the corner, but into the hedge itself, swallowed like smoke into branches. She didn't follow. Not this time. Back in her room, another note waited on her pillow. She hadn't left the door unlocked. She hadn't left the key behind. But there it was, tucked under the towel she'd draped over the mirror. You were never supposed to forget. That was the only rule. The words turned over in her mind like stones being sifted by a river. What was she forgetting? That night, she didn't sleep. Not even briefly. She sat by the window, eyes wide, heart calm, in a way that felt unnatural, like it belonged to someone who had been here too long. At exactly midnight, a soft knock came from the door. One knock, then silence. She didn't move, and from outside the window, a face slowly pressed against the paper screen, just the faint outline of eyes and cheekbones forming in the stretched fabric, but they didn't match her reflection. They were older, sadder, and they were hers. Hana stayed perfectly still, watching the imprint on the paper screen breathe with the rhythm of her own chest. It wasn't just the face that unsettled her. It was the knowledge that it belonged here more than she did, that it had waited for her to arrive, not with hunger or anger, but with inevitability, as if this moment had already happened before again and again, like a ritual drawn in soft breath and old grief. When she blinked, the face on the screen faded, not disappearing, but withdrawing like fog rolling back into the mountains. She didn't approach the window, didn't open the door. The key in her pocket felt cold now, heavier, and when she touched it, she noticed something new etched along its edge, delicate hand-carved script she hadn't seen before. She took it to the mirror. The towel she had draped over the glass had slipped slightly. Her reflection stood there waiting. The key's edge bore a single-character GE memory. She didn't remember carving it. She didn't remember much at all now that she thought of it. Her last weeks before arriving at the inn were misted over vague. She remembered a job somewhere urban, colorless. Remembered headaches, nightmares, a prescription. Then one day she'd woken up with a note clutched in her hand. Go to Yamashiro Inn. You'll find what you lost. It had no signature. It was written in her handwriting. Now, the inn shifted around her like a house stretching its joints. The hallway outside her room had grown longer overnight. Lamps now flickered with a dull amber glow instead of warm light. The corridor's corners sagged subtly inward, like the building was folding in on itself. She walked it anyway. She had to see if the other rooms still existed. But the doors were all gone. Just walls now paper and wood stretching unbroken. No signs of room 5 or 6, just hers. Room 7, and further down the door she'd opened before the Subo Bouquet room was sealed again. But this time, her name was scratched not on the door frame, but along the floorboards, in dozens of tiny repetitions. Hana, Hana, Hana. Some were fresh, the wood still pale where the scratches had bitten deep. Others were older, stained dark with age. She bent to touch one. The floor groaned beneath her hand. Not creaked, groaned like a body roused from sleep. Then silence. In the dining hall, which she hadn't visited before long, tables had been arranged with empty plates. Dust lay thick across the bowls, the chopsticks arranged neatly, but untouched. On one cushion, there was a bowl that had recently been disturbed. Clean. No dust. No food either. Just a single black hair coiled like a question mark inside the ceramic. And at the far end of the table, a place setting that mirrored her own breakfast. Rice miso, pickled radish. Still warm. A note beside it. Sit. She didn't want to. She did. The moment she sat, a door behind the tatami screen slid open on its own, revealing a figure kneeling on the other side. Dressed in white. Face hidden by a curtain of straight, jet-black hair. The figure bowed slightly, and then raised a hand not in greeting, but in imitation mirroring the way Hana held her chopsticks. She moved. The figure followed. She dropped the chopsticks. So did the figure. And then it looked up. The face beneath the hair was blank, smooth like porcelain left unfinished, but not featureless. Something stirred beneath the surface, as though eyes and lips were just waiting to rise like shapes beneath shallow water. And then the head tilted ever so slowly to the right. So did Hana's. She felt her body move, not on command, but in response. Not possession. Something worse. Synchronization. Like two pendulums finally swinging in time. She stood and backed away. The figure remained kneeling, but raised one finger to its lips. Not for silence, for remembrance. Then it pointed to Hana's shadow cast behind her on the floor. It was moving. She turned and ran. By the time she made it back to room 7, the walls had begun to hum. Not with voices, but with low frequency, like the deep, resonant sound of temple bells, buried under earth. She slammed the door shut and pressed her back to it, the thrum crawling up her spine. On the futon, folded neatly, lay the red yukata the little girl had worn. Clean pressed the broken fan placed atop it like a gift. The tag now read, "Welcome back." She should have left. She should have screamed, escaped, done anything but sit down and press her hands to her face. Instead, she whispered what had been hovering at the edge of her mind for days. "I've been here before." Not a question, a memory. The words fell from her lips like a lock turning, and with them came an ache, not in her head, but somewhere deeper, like a hidden bruise beneath old skin. I've been here before. She didn't know when she'd arrived the first time, didn't know how long she had stayed, but now the inn responded to her admission as though it had been waiting for that phrase to open its true self. The lantern outside her room flared briefly, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The floorboards underfoot no longer creaked. They sighed like someone lying down after centuries standing. She held the red yukata in her hands. The fabric was worn soft with age, but it smelled faintly of persimmons and dust, a scent she remembered from childhood but couldn't name. She folded it back into place carefully, almost reverently, and turned her attention to the fan. It was paper and bamboo painted with a single faded blossom. As she touched its edge, she saw for the briefest moment the child's face again, not in the room, not in the mirror, but in her mind. A flash of wide eyes, open mouth, a short breath drawn as if to scream, then gone. There were memories hidden in this place like insects under floorboards, alive, scuttling just beyond the edge of perception. She needed to dig deeper, not to escape anymore, but to understand. Because if the inn wouldn't let her leave, perhaps it wasn't meant to be a prison. Perhaps it was a mirror, and she was the thing being reflected. She ventured out again past the dining hall through a passage she hadn't noticed before, though something told her it had always been there. It curved gently downward like a spiral uncoiling into the earth. The further she descended, the more the inn's architecture began to change. Wood gave way to stone. The lanterns became less frequent, flickering with blue flame instead of yellow. Walls no longer bore paper screens or decorative scrolls, only carvings. They lined the corridor, etched deeply in sweeping brush strokes, names hundreds of them. Some repeated, some scratched out, and some she realized with a chill, written in her own hand. She paused before one carved near the base of the wall. Her name, again, Hana, but beneath it, a second line had been added. Not a name, a question. Who did you bring with you? The temperature dropped. She walked faster. The hall ended at a doorway framed with braided rope and prayer strips, most of them torn or rotting. It wasn't locked, but she felt resistance as she pushed like water or memory, thick and unwilling. Still it gave way, and she stepped inside a circular chamber domed like a well's interior. Candles ringed the edges, flickering in unison. At the center stood a mirror. Not a small one, but a full-length glass set into a lacquered frame, its surface murky, as if filled with smoke. She approached slowly, expecting once again to see her reflection out of sync, her eyes too wide, her smile too steady. But this time the mirror showed nothing, no reflection at all. Instead, it shimmered, and then it showed a room hers. Room 7, in perfect stillness. The futon empty, the yukata gone, then movement. Someone standing by the window, a woman, her back to the room. Long black hair cascading over her shoulders. Her hands folded. Hana whispered, "That's not me." But the woman turned, and her face was a perfect match. Expressionless, calm, patient. She lifted her hand in the mirror. So did Hana. The gestures matched. But then the woman in the mirror spoke, not with lips but with eyes. A deep, knowing sorrow that pulsed with silent words. "I stayed too long. You have to remember before she does." The mirror shattered. 1,000 shards sprayed outward, but Hana wasn't cut. The glass scattered around her, unmoving, frozen midair, like time had been caught holding its breath. And in the broken pieces, 100 reflections stared back, some of her, some of others. All versions of herself she didn't remember being, dressed in different eras, different expressions. Some smiling, some crying, one bleeding from the eyes. Then everything dropped. The room went dark, and she was standing not in the chamber but outside, in the garden. Only it wasn't night anymore. It was neither night nor day, just stillness. The koi pond now stretched wide, far larger than before, its edge swallowed into shadow. And the inn behind her didn't look like an inn. It looked like a temple abandoned mid-ritual, its roof sagging under the weight of things left unsaid. And then came the whisper, so soft it might have been inside her skull. "You didn't come alone." She turned, and the little girl in red stood there again. But this time the girl's eyes were empty, glassy, her mouth sewn shut with red thread. She lifted one hand and pointed toward Hana's shadow. It was splitting. 2 heads, 2 sets of shoulders, and only one body. Hana froze. Her shadow on the stones beneath her feet should have mirrored her exactly. But it didn't. It was stretching, elongating, widening at the shoulders, and then subtly splitting down the middle, as if another figure were peeling itself from her outline. 2 heads now rose from one silhouette. One moved when she did. The other stood still. She turned sharply, but no one was behind her. The garden was silent, save for the gentle trickle of water from the koi pond and the almost imperceptible rustle of dry blossoms as the wind passed through the trees. But her shadow remained doubled, and the little girl in red did not blink. Hana opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. The girl tilted her head and slowly raised her small hand again, not to point, not to gesture, but to trace a shape in the air. A circle. Then a line, then a second line intersecting the first. She repeated the motion over and over until Hana recognized it. The same shape that had been etched on the prayer strips near the lower chamber. A warding mark. Old. Shinto or older meant not to trap evil, but to keep the dead from remembering too much of the living. The koi pond rippled again, not from wind, from breath. Beneath the surface, Hana saw faces now. Dozens. Some clear, some blurred, drifting just below like bodies pressed to thin glass. She saw the little girl. She saw herself. She saw women in wedding kimonos and school uniforms, in ancient robes and work attire, all silent, all watching. And then the surface rippled once more and cleared. In the water's reflection, the Yamashiro Inn burned. Flames consumed the frame, licked across the beams in slow, deliberate tongues. But when Hana spun to look at the inn behind her, it remained intact. Quiet, peaceful. A breeze caught the lanterns, but no fire danced along the edges. Still, she saw the smoke curling upward in the reflection, saw shadows running along the roof tiles, heard somehow drums slow and steady, like those played in a funeral march. She staggered back and found herself standing at the inn's entrance again. No memory of walking, only the sense that the place had drawn her back, pulled her across space with invisible strings. The front door stood open now, though no one had opened it. She stepped through her feet, moving of their own accord, and saw that the entrance hall had changed. The floor had been stripped of tatami. Now it was stone engraved with a massive version of the warding symbol the girl had traced. The reception counter was gone. In its place stood an altar. A candle burned on either side of a small shrine box, and above it, nailed into the wall, was a wooden tablet with 2 names carved in blood-dark ink. Hana Ishikawa Yamashiro Kyuko. The first was her name. The second was her grandmother's. Her knees gave way. She dropped to the floor, breathing in sharp, shallow gulps, her mind spinning. Kyuko had spoken little of her youth, had never once mentioned the inn, had never said the family owned property like this, and yet her name was enshrined here, memorialized as though she had never left. The implication settled over Hannah like snowfall, slow, soft, but cold enough to choke. Her grandmother had never left this place. She had only left her body. Something clinked on the floor behind her. She turned, and there, just before the sliding door that led deeper into the inn, lay an old photograph. Sepia-toned, curled at the edges. She picked it up with trembling fingers. A group of girls seated formally before the inn. 5 of them, all in white yukata, all looking solemn, unsmiling. At the center, a slightly older girl, long dark hair, eyes sharp, Kyuko. Younger than Hana had ever seen her, but unmistakable. And beside her, clutching her hand tightly, a smaller girl with short hair and a blank expression. Hana, not someone who looked like her. Her, the same eyes, the same shape of face, even the same slight scar on the lip from when she'd fallen off her bicycle at age 8. The photo dropped from her fingers. She backed away from the shrine, her breath quickening, and turned toward the hallway. It had changed again. The paper walls had yellowed. The wood had deepened in color, saturated with years. The ceiling had lowered slightly. Everything looked older, more worn. And she now realized the photos along the hallway walls were of guests. But as she passed each one, she saw the same pattern. Each guest reappeared in every decade. Their names changed. Their clothes changed. But the faces did not. They had all returned. Again and again and again. She turned a corner and found her own face waiting for her on a frame, dated 1954. Caption, Hana Ishikawa, last guest of the season. She touched the glass and whispered, "I wasn't even born then." And from the end of the hallway, something began to walk toward her. Not run, not lurch, just steady steps, measured, slow. She waited too long before turning to flee, and the hallway had no end anymore. Hana ran. Her feet barely touched the floor as she moved through the shifting hallways of the inn corridors, now impossibly long, impossibly bent, folding in on themselves like the petals of a night-blooming flower. The wood beneath her soles no longer creaked. It pulsed warm and damp, as though she were running across a living thing's ribcage. Lanterns overhead hissed and popped, casting her shadow again and again onto paper walls that breathed faintly in and out. Behind her, the slow, deliberate footsteps never changed pace. They didn't need to. She understood now what walked behind her had all the time in the world. At some point she turned too sharply and fell into a room that hadn't been there before. She landed on her hands, the old wood stained with ink or something darker. The room was small, square, and lit only by the soft blue glow of a single candle in the far corner. Its flame did not flicker, no matter how she gasped, no matter how she moved. On the walls were scrolls, not decorative, not art. They were covered in names, ink brushed in long, sorrowful strokes. Some crossed out violently, others rewritten over and over, and scattered among them were drawings, sketches of faces. The little girl, the blank-faced woman, her own reflection drawn with such meticulous detail that she felt sick just looking at it. She stood slowly and approached the candle. Something beneath it shimmered faintly. A mirror shard barely the size of her palm embedded in the floor. She crouched and peered into it. Her face stared back, but she was crying. She hadn't realized she was. A tear dropped from her chin and landed on the shard, and the image warped. A voice not spoken aloud but unfolding within her chest like origami rose from the silence. She doesn't want you to remember who you are, because if you do, you leave her alone again. Hana clenched her hands, forcing the shaking to stop. Who she said out loud, though no one was there to answer. The air changed, the candle dimmed, and in the reflection of the mirror shard, her face was no longer hers. It was Kyuko's, older, worn, her eyes brimming with something between pain and rage. Her mouth moved, whispering soundless words, and then, in a flash too quick to stop, the face twisted into something blackened and decayed, cheeks, sunken lips, split eyes like burnt coals, and the candle went out. Darkness swallowed the room. A chill, sudden and sharp, bit into her neck, and she turned on instinct. She wasn't alone anymore. The breath of another being filled the air beside her ear. Slow, measured, inhale, exhale. She bolted forward, hands outstretched, scraping against the walls until she found the sliding door and forced it open. Light flooded in, dim but present. She stepped out into the hallway again, except it wasn't a hallway. It was a garden, but not the one she remembered. This version of the garden was dead. The koi pond dried to a cracked basin, the cherry trees leafless, their bark peeling like old skin. The stone lanterns were broken, their tops scattered on the ground. And where the pond had once been, a single well stood old and moss-covered, its rope frayed and dangling. A voice called her name. She turned. The little girl stood at the edge of the well, but something was wrong. Her eyes were not empty this time. They were hers, Hana's, mirrored back at her with devastating clarity. And in her hands, the girl held the red yukata folded perfectly. She extended it forward, as if offering it back. Hana approached every step heavy with resistance, not from fear, but from some deep recognition she couldn't yet name. "Who are you?" she asked. The girl looked up and her lips moved, not sewn shut, now not stitched with silence. Her voice was young, but old, echoing. "Tired. You left me down there. I waited. You said you'd come back." "I don't remember," Hana whispered. "I swear I don't." The girl shook her head. "Not this time. But you remembered before." Every time a little more. Hana looked past her, into the mouth of the well. It wasn't empty. There was a figure at the bottom, sitting in the shadows, knees pulled to chest, rocking slightly. Long hair hung down like wet strings. The moment Hana's gaze locked onto her, the figure stilled, lifted its head. Even at that distance, Hana could feel her heart react, thudding once with such force it left her dizzy, because the figure at the bottom of the well was also her, bruised, pale, silent, waiting. "Why are there two of me?" she asked. But the girl in red simply dropped the yukata at Hana's feet and backed away step by step until she vanished into the garden's mist. The shadows closed in around the well, and Hana found herself drawn to it, her body betraying her thoughts. She peered over the edge again. The figure still sat there. Then it lifted one hand and pointed up at her. The implication was clear. It was her turn to go down. The well exhaled a breath, older than time, its air damp with mildew, and something deeper, an ancient sorrow that clung to the stone like moss. Hana's hands tightened on the rim as the figure below continued pointing at her, its pale arm unwavering. Something about the gesture wasn't accusatory, it was expectant. Like a long-delayed reunion was about to happen, and it had waited through lifetimes for her to come back. She leaned closer, squinting into the darkness, trying to see her own eyes reflected in the face below. But the figure had blurred, as if the more she stared, the more indistinct it became. Only the eyes remained clear, wide, dark, and fixed on hers with the sharp ache of betrayal. Hana stepped back, heart racing. She didn't want to descend, but every part of the inn, the endless halls, the distorted photographs, the vanished doors had led her here. It wasn't a choice. It was a return. She glanced around the dead garden. The cherry trees stood like silent mourners. The cracked basin of the pond mirrored a sky that had long since ceased to shift from dusk. There was no wind, no insects, not even the rustle of distant life. Everything here had quieted to listen. Near the base of the well, coiled in the weeds, was the rope, frayed but intact. She tested its weight. It held. The stones lining the well's interior were slick with age, but not impossible to climb. She wrapped the rope around her wrists, took a deep breath, and began to descend. The darkness swallowed her quickly, the gray above shrinking to a coin of light that flickered as her feet met the stones. The air thickened the further down she went. Her breath echoed off the walls like whispers that didn't quite belong to her. She remembered the stories, local folklore tales of girls who vanished into wells of spirits, trapped by regret, of children who befriended shadows that answered back. Tales her grandmother once told, always ending with a warning: never listen when the well calls your name. She was halfway down when her foot slipped. For one terrible second, she dangled arms, burning heart in her throat. The well responded with a low groan like the belly of the earth shifting. Her boot found purchase again, and she continued slower, now deliberate. Below her, the figure remained still. When her feet touched bottom, the world went silent. She turned. The girl herself stood mere feet away, no longer sitting, no longer blurred. This version of Hana looked exactly as she had when she first arrived. Same clothes, same wind-tossed hair, same quiet fear in her eyes. But there was one difference. The skin around her mouth had dark threads like the remnants of old stitching. Her lips parted slowly with effort. "You left me," the reflection whispered voice, thick like something unused for years. I waited in the dark. Every time you forgot, I stayed. I didn't know, Hana said, voice shaking. I didn't remember. You did. Once. You climbed out. You became someone else. You got to forget. But I'm still here. The well around them began to pulse the stones, vibrating with low energy. Faint echoes of other voices, other Hanas, whispered in fractured tones, fragments of regret, half-formed apologies. The trapped selves of all the versions she had been guests of the inn, across time echoed through the dark, each one caught in the same story, with only slight variations. And she understood now. The inn wasn't haunted by angry spirits. It was haunted by memory, and she was both the guest and the ghost. The girl in front of her stepped forward. I can't hold her alone anymore. Who? The one who keeps the inn standing. The one who doesn't want us to leave. The one Kyuko made a pact with when she begged for a second chance. The earth above trembled. A crack raced down the well wall, dust falling in faint spirals. Hana reached out without thinking, touching her other self's hand. It was cold, but it gripped back. I'll remember, Hana said. All of it. You have to take me with you. If you climb out without me again, I disappear. Forever. And then you'll forget again. Like you always do. Above, the circle of sky had darkened. The garden was fading, the inn's shape collapsing into shadow. The final test wasn't survival, it was reunification. She knelt, wrapping her arms around the girl herself, and felt the two of them begin to merge, not physically, but in memory. Fragments poured in, standing in front of room 7 with different luggage, leaving offerings at the shrine, hearing footsteps that matched her own, names whispered in sleep, guests who greeted her like a sister, the little girl in red who was never a stranger, only a memory she'd sealed away. When she stood again, the well was empty, but for her, the girl was gone. Or rather, she was whole. Above, the rope swung gently. She climbed. Her hands burned as she gripped the rope and pulled herself upward, every knot pressing into her skin like the bite of old truths. The stones of the well were damp, but no longer cold. Instead, there was a warmth, now subtle, unsettling, like the breath of something enormous, waiting just beyond the lip of the well, too patient to stir. With each climb, she felt memories anchoring themselves, no longer fleeting images, but entire scenes searing into place. The first time she had come to the Yamashiro Inn as a child following her grandmother's footsteps. The first time she had seen the red yukata perfectly folded on the bed. A game they'd told her. A tradition. Hide and seek, but the kind where you never knew who was seeking whom. As her head rose above the rim of the well, the garden reformed around her. No longer withered and dead, but transformed. Not alive either. The colors were richer, deeper. The trees in full bloom but unmoving. The koi pond full again, though the fish floated unnaturally still, their eyes open and unblinking. A painted stillness had draped itself across everything, and at the center of it all, the inn stood with a serenity that felt staged like a dream you suspected was too perfect to last. She stepped out and turned, half expecting the little girl in red to greet her. But the garden was empty. No voices, no whispers, only her own thoughts. And in those thoughts, the realization that she had never truly left the inn. Not in this life, not in the others. Yamashiro wasn't a place in time. It was a convergence, a site where memory, grief, and unfinished promises looped together in a tapestry too delicate to tear, too strong to escape. That's why her name had appeared again and again in the guest logs and the photos in the shrine. She was part of the story, one of the knots tied into the rope of this place. The door to the inn opened for her, not by hand, but by invitation. She crossed the threshold without hesitation this time, her feet knowing the weight of the wood beneath them. The entrance was empty. The shrine was gone. The floors were clean, the paper walls unmarred. For a moment, it could have been any other night at any other traditional inn in the mountains. But then she heard the soft shuffle of feet upstairs, the creak of a floorboard beneath deliberate weight. She followed it, the hallway narrowing as she moved, familiar and yet slightly altered, like a dream revisited too many times. Room 7 waited, its sliding door ajar. Inside the room was lit by soft lantern light. The futon was laid out, the red yukata folded neatly on top as always. But now beside it sat a figure, upright, composed, hair neatly tied, a presence that radiated calm like the eye of a long-forgotten storm. Her grandmother, Kyuko, turned slowly, revealing a face both young and impossibly aged, as though time itself had wrapped around her, but failed to unravel the spirit beneath. Her eyes met Hana's with no surprise, no recognition of time passed, only relief, as if waiting had been her only occupation. "You remember now," she said quietly. Hana nodded. "I didn't want to," she replied. "No one ever does. That's why they return." Kyuko gestured to the space beside her. "Sit. Let me explain before the inn takes the memory again." Hana sat, the tatami familiar beneath her, the scent of persimmon and incense rising in waves. Kyuko continued, her voice steady. "I came here first in 1938. I was young, foolish. I thought this place was just an inn with strange customs and prettier ghosts than the ones I brought with me. But the Yamashiro Inn doesn't just collect guests. It keeps the unfinished. People with memories too dangerous to hold and too painful to forget." "You stayed," Hana whispered. "I bargained. I asked for one more chance. For a daughter. For a granddaughter. I thought if I left, I could bury the past. But the past doesn't rot here. It waits. And when your mother died, the cycle pulled tighter. It needed another," Mihana said. "Yes, you were always meant to return. But this time something changed. You came back more complete. The pieces of you didn't scatter like they usually do. You remembered too much. The inn can't erase you anymore." Hana looked down at her hands. They no longer trembled. "So what now?" Kyuko smiled faintly, a sadness woven into her features. "You choose. Stay and the inn lives through you. It will be warm and quiet and you'll never fear again. But you'll forget. Eventually. Or leave and carry everything with you. Every story. Every face. Every moment you lived here in every life. The silence stretched, and Hana answered, I'm tired of forgetting. Kyuko closed her eyes. Then walk out the front door. Don't look back. Not even once. And so she stood. Walked past the lanterns. Down the hallway that had always been too long. Past the photographs which now faded as she passed the ink lifting from the frames like mist. Down the stairs. Across the entrance. To the door. And just as her fingers touched the handle, she heard a child's voice behind her. Promise you won't forget me. But Hana kept walking, and the door opened. The moment Hana stepped over the threshold, the world shifted. The warm air of the inn steeped in incense, and memory gave way to something crisp and sharp, like the first breath taken after waking from a long, suffocating dream. The sunlight outside was real, not the twilight haze that blanketed the Yamashiro garden, but golden and full, filtering through the trees of a modern hillside. The sound of birdsong reached her ears, fractured and strange after so many hours, so many lives spent in silence. She paused just outside the door, her feet planted on the stone path, waiting for the pull for the inn's invisible hands to claw her back. But nothing happened. She turned slowly. The Yamashiro Inn was gone. Behind her stood only forest, a clearing with overgrown stone steps, and the faint remnants of a wooden frame buried beneath ivy and moss. Where there should have been a 2-story ryokan rich with lantern light and flickering shadows, there was now a ruin. The inn had collapsed on itself years ago. Rot had eaten through its bones. Nature had claimed it as forgotten architecture, and yet she had been inside. Hana reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers closed around something soft fabric. She drew it out slowly, and there impossibly folded lay the red yukata, clean, untouched by time. She stared at it, hands trembling, the weight of its presence too heavy to ignore. She pressed it to her chest. It didn't feel haunted. It felt familiar, like a keepsake from a place that had loved her in its own terrible, unforgettable way. Down the path, a car was parked, her car, the driver's side door still open, her backpack slouched in the front seat. It hadn't been days or weeks. The clock on the dashboard blinked, still set to the same hour she'd arrived. Less than 3 hours had passed in this world. She sat behind the wheel, starting the engine out of habit. Her reflection in the rearview mirror looked the same almost. The eyes were older, steadier, and something deep behind them had changed shape, as if the soul inside had unfolded a hidden room it didn't know it possessed. The drive down the mountain was slow. Her phone buzzed once, then again. Texts from coworkers, a missed call from an unknown number, the kind of digital noise that had once felt urgent and now seemed so absurdly small. She ignored them all. The forest thinned. The winding roads straightened, and the world reassembled itself into familiar geometry: gas stations, traffic lights, the anonymous hum of regular life. She reached her apartment just as the sky began to tint with evening. Not the eternal dusk of the Yamashiro Inn, but real fleeting twilight. She set the yukata on her nightstand, hesitating before turning off the lights. Part of her still expected something to appear in the shadows. A sound, a whisper, a child's voice asking to be remembered. But the room stayed quiet. The next morning, Hana stood in front of her bathroom mirror with a toothbrush in hand, staring at something etched faintly into the corner of the glass. A symbol, a circle crossed by 2 lines. It hadn't been there before. She blinked, rubbed her thumb over it. The glass was smooth, no scratch, no residue. But when she stepped back, the mark remained only visible in certain angles of light. Not a warning, she realized. A seal, and for the first time she felt its meaning settle over her. Not imprisonment, but protection. From forgetting. That night she dreamed of the garden again, not dead, but alive. The koi moved. The trees swayed, and the little girl in red sat beneath a blooming sakura drawing circles in the dirt with her finger. Hana sat beside her silent. "You remembered me," the girl said. "I did, and now I won't disappear." "No," Hana whispered, "you'll grow." The girl smiled a small thing and leaned against her shoulder. No longer just a memory, no longer just a ghost. When Hana awoke, she found the yukata still folded on the nightstand, and beside it, a photograph she didn't remember taking sepia-toned edges curled. Her and her grandmother, standing outside the Yamashiro Inn, smiling. The photograph lingered in Hana's hand long after the morning light had filled the room. It was worn but not dusty, as if time had touched it, but chosen not to erode its edges. Her grandmother's smile in the image was gentle, wistful, captured mid-turn, as if she were already aware of the story unfolding beyond the frame. Hana herself looked younger in the photo, though she couldn't recall ever posing for it. The backdrop was unmistakable, the Yamashiro Inn perfectly intact, framed by two blooming plum trees that no longer existed in the present. The strangeness of it should have unsettled her, but instead, it felt grounding, like proof that something within the madness had been real, or at least real enough to leave a trace. She placed the photograph into a small wooden box with the red yukata and closed the lid carefully, almost reverently. Whatever bond she'd reformed, whatever broken memories she'd rejoined, it didn't feel like a curse. Not anymore. It felt like a responsibility. A fragile secret now part of her marrow. For the first time in days, no lives, she showered with real water, drank tea that didn't taste of incense, and sat by her kitchen window watching the world pass by. The street below bustled with ordinary life delivery trucks, groaning up the incline, neighbors walking their dogs, an elderly woman sweeping fallen leaves into neat meditative piles. It was a different kind of silence here, not oppressive, but honest. She breathed it in slowly. The air carried no spirits, no secrets, just wind and faint jasmine from a garden 2 floors down. But as the days went on, Hana began to notice things, subtle at first. In the steam of her morning tea, a fleeting glimpse of a woman's face, hers, yet older, more tired, fading the moment she looked directly. In the sound of dripping water at night, the distinct echo of rope twisting over wood, and in mirrors, especially the small one by the hallway, a glimpse of red where there should only be beige. Still nothing followed her. The inn didn't reclaim her. The whispers didn't return. What remained was not presence, but memory. And memory, once stirred, refuses to settle. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in her closet, Hana found a journal. Not hers. The leather cover was worn smooth, the corners curved from use. Inside, delicate handwriting filled the pages. Names, dates, observations. Some pages were in Japanese, others in English, and a few in an older dialect she struggled to decipher. The entries spoke of the inn, of rituals, of the guest cycle, and repetition through grief. At first, she assumed it had belonged to her grandmother, but several entries bore dates long after Kyuko's death. The latest entry was dated 3 years ago. The new girl arrived today. She chose room 7, though I don't think she knows why. The pattern continues. I watch, but I do not interfere. Not yet. If she makes it out, she may be the last. Below the entry, a faint signature M, nothing more. Hana closed the journal. Her hands trembled. Someone else had been watching. Someone outside the inn's grip. A caretaker. A historian. A witness. Or something else entirely. That night she dreamt again, but it wasn't the garden. She stood in a long hallway, lined with rice paper doors, all marked with names she couldn't quite read. At the far end stood a tall figure, draped in shadow, its face hidden behind a mask, plain white, featureless. In its hand, it held a paper lantern that glowed with no flame, only memory. When Hana tried to speak, her voice didn't rise. The figure simply lifted the lantern and pointed to a door. Her door. Room 7. It slid open soundlessly. Inside, nothing but her reflection. Dozens of them standing shoulder to shoulder in the tatami-lined space, each one from a different time, dressed in clothes she didn't recognize. All of them stared at her in unison, and as one they whispered, "Tell our story," she woke with a start. Her room was dark, but not cold. The window was open. The wind had scattered loose pages from the journal across the floor. That morning, Hana bought a notebook. Not a digital one, not a device, a real notebook. Blank pages, a place to begin. She sat at her desk, pen in hand, and wrote, "The Yamashiro Inn is not a haunted house in the traditional sense. It is an echo chamber for the soul, a reflection pool for grief and memory. Those who stay there do not simply sleep, they remember. They become whole. And sometimes they return." She paused, then added, "I am the last guest, but I will not be the last witness." She began to write. The pages filled slowly, deliberately. Hana didn't rush. She treated the act like ritual, boiling water, steeping tea, setting the notebook on the sunlit table beside her window, and writing in the quietest hours of morning. The words came not from memory alone, but from something deeper, a well inside her that she hadn't realized existed, as though the versions of herself left behind in the inn were gently guiding her hand. She wrote about the hallway that shifted behind her back, the scent of dustless tatami, the way footsteps could echo even when you stood still. She wrote about the photographs that changed after midnight, the shrine with names that didn't belong to the living, the futon that felt warm as if someone had just left it. She wrote about Kyuko, not just as her grandmother, but as a girl, a mother, a woman who made a pact to protect something sacred and dangerous. She wrote about the child in red, not as a ghost, but as a shard of innocence fractured by time. Each word seemed to solidify the memories, to etch them into permanence. It became her daily compass. Yet something curious began to happen as the pages accumulated. Her dreams changed. They didn't take her back to the inn anymore, not fully. Instead, she found herself in other places, stillness-soaked villages where no one spoke above a whisper, narrow mountain paths lit by lanterns with no flames, a schoolhouse sinking slowly into a pond with children sitting quietly at their desks, all of them watching her, all of them familiar. At first, she thought it was just the mind unraveling its knots after trauma. But then, while shopping for groceries one evening, she saw it. A flyer tacked to the bulletin board near the entrance, yellowed edges, handwritten, a missing persons notice. The name at the top was Naoko Watanabe, age 34, disappeared last year. Beneath the name was a photo, ordinary, bland, captured in passport light, but Hana's breath caught. She'd seen that face before, not in the inn, but in her dreams, sitting on a porch beneath a paper umbrella, staring into the woods as though waiting for someone, as though waiting for her. The world rippled for a moment, then smoothed. Back home, she checked the journal again. Flipping toward the middle, she found an entry dated 8 years ago. Naoko arrived carrying a broken music box. She placed it in the shrine before checking in. She did not leave. No signature this time, just the entry ending in a faded ink blot, as if whoever wrote it had hesitated, then vanished. The story, Hana realized, wasn't just hers. It never had been. The Yamashiro Inn was a resting place for unfinished stories, for people who had unspoken grief questions that refused to settle. It was not merely haunted by ghosts, but by human truths that refused to be buried. And now, Hana had become a thread in that tapestry, the one who remembered, the one who could write. And she wasn't alone. Emails began arriving. Comments on her quiet blog where she had started sharing fragments of the story in vague, dreamlike tones. Strangers responded. Some said they had stayed at an inn, just like it in Nagano or Yamagata, or a village that didn't appear on any maps. Some described the same hallway. The red yukata, the girl, the shrine, the rope. Others confessed they couldn't sleep after reading, that the story felt familiar in a way they couldn't explain. A few claimed they dreamed of Room 7. One message stood out. No subject, no signature. You're not the only one. There are more of us. Keep writing. You're waking the others. She read it 3 times. Deleted it. Then, after a moment, retrieved it from the trash folder and read it again. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting the buildings in long shadows. She stood at her window and looked toward the horizon where the hills began, where the forest had swallowed the old road. Something stirred in her, not fear, not exactly, but awareness. That she had opened a door not just for herself, but for many. That stories were not meant to be sealed away forever. That night she dreamed once more, but this time she wasn't in a room or a hallway. She stood at the entrance to the inn. Only it wasn't falling apart, nor was it pristine. It was rebuilding, as if memory itself were stitching it back together one floorboard at a time, one lantern at a time. Her grandmother stood just inside, not as a ghost, but as herself, alive, tired, watching. You're doing it, Kyuko whispered, and then Hana saw them. Guests, hundreds, some familiar, others strangers, all waiting. And then she understood the inn wasn't just a place for endings. It was also a beginning, a bridge between the weight of the past and the fragile possibility of healing. Not everyone could cross it, but some only needed to be remembered. When Hana awoke, she knew what she had to do. She picked up her pen and kept writing. The seasons turned quietly around Hana as she continued to write. Her apartment, once a sterile retreat from grief, had become a sanctuary of stories. The walls were lined with hand-scribbled notes, photocopied old articles, sketches of floor plans she remembered from dreams. Each page added to her journal was like laying another tile in the strange winding path that had become her life since the Yamashiro Inn. She no longer chased explanations. The logic of the inn of that realm between memory and spirit did not follow the rules of time or gravity. It moved in circles, in shadows, in bloodlines, and in the ink that now stained her fingers daily. Though she rarely spoke about it to anyone outside her growing online audience, something within her had begun to shift. The barrier between the ordinary and the unseen had thinned. She didn't see ghosts in the traditional sense, but she often felt rooms remembering her when she entered, or caught the scent of cherry blossoms in concrete stairwells where no flowers could bloom. Occasionally, elevators would take her to floors. Not listed doors would creak open before she touched them, and she'd hear a child humming a song she never knew, but could somehow hum along to. At first, she flinched at these moments. Now she welcomed them, signs that the story continued to thread its way through the waking world. One winter morning, she received a letter, not an email, a real letter. The envelope was handmade, delicate and fibrous like the rice paper she'd seen at the inn. There was no return address. Inside a single sheet, inked with a hand she recognized only from the old journal. If you still remember Room 7, meet me during the new moon in the woods beyond Nagano Station. There is more. You've only written half the truth. It was signed M. The letter didn't alarm her. It felt inevitable. She packed lightly, just a notebook, her voice recorder, a small thermos of tea, and the red yukata folded and wrapped in cloth. She didn't need directions. Something within her still remembered the old path. She arrived 2 days before the new moon and stayed in a quiet inn on the outskirts of town. The forest lay beyond a tangle of rural roads, but as she walked them, every curve of the trail felt choreographed. She didn't see other travelers, only a fox once pausing at a distance to meet her gaze before slipping silently back into the underbrush. By the time she arrived at the meeting point, a mossy stone torii, barely holding its shape against the wind, the sky had already turned indigo. She waited, her breath fogging the air, the hush of winter surrounding her, like a thick wool blanket. And then he appeared. M was a man in his 50s, perhaps older, tall, spare, and dressed like he'd stepped from another time. His eyes were the only part of him that looked truly alive, sharp, unblinking, too knowing. He didn't introduce himself. He merely stood beside her and said, "You saw it all, but you didn't see why." Together, without a word more, they walked deeper into the forest. Hana expected more ruins, more ghostly relics of the past. Instead, they reached a clearing where the earth felt raw, like something had been torn out of it recently. In the center, there was a circle of stones, some carved with symbols she didn't recognize, and others marked with names she did. Her grandmother's, Naoko Watanabe's, even her own. "I buried them," M said softly. "The ones who couldn't carry it back." Hana's voice felt caught in her throat. "And me, you walked out. But part of you didn't. And that part is why you still see." He handed her a tattered photograph. It was old, sepia-toned. The Yamashiro Inn. But this time in the window on the second floor, she could see her own face, watching from the shadows. "I've been collecting these for years," he said. "Every guest that returned or didn't. But you're different. You broke the rhythm. You wrote. And that means the pattern's unraveling." "What happens when it unravels?" she asked. He looked toward the sky. The moon was gone. Only stars blinked down. Either the inn fades completely, or it reforms into something else. But stories like that don't just die. They feed on belief, memory, attention. If people keep listening, it becomes real again. Not in the same place, not in the same shape, but somewhere. He placed the photograph in her hand and closed her fingers over it. "Keep telling it, but be careful what you finish. Endings matter more than you think." Then, without waiting, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Hana stood there for a long time, watching the place where he'd gone. The wind whispered through the branches like breath, and the stars above seemed to shift. She unwrapped the yukata and laid it gently over one of the stones bearing no name. Then, from her coat, she pulled her notebook and began to write. Not about ghosts or rituals, but about memory, about what it meant to carry pieces of other lives inside you, about the responsibility of remembering. She stayed until morning. When she walked back to the inn, frost painted the edges of the trees. Her feet felt lighter. There was no more fear, only the story. Back in Tokyo, the city's pulse seemed softer somehow, less abrasive. Maybe it was Hana who had changed, or perhaps it was the way memory alters everything after it opens a door. She returned to her apartment with wind-tangled hair and muddy shoes, but there was a stillness to her, a clarity that hadn't been there before. She didn't speak to anyone about the trip, not even in her blog. Some truth, she realized, couldn't be shared without dissolving into fiction. Instead, she resumed her ritual, waking before the sun, writing by lamplight, pouring hot tea, as if the steam itself whispered instructions from the unseen. The stories she wrote were no longer centered around the Yamashiro Inn, not directly, but echoes of it rippled through each tale. A photograph that changes each night, a forgotten room behind a mirror, a train that never arrives but always departs. She layered them with subtlety, embedding secrets like threads in a tapestry. Her followers noticed. The comments grew longer, stranger. People claimed to dream about the places she described. One reader wrote, "The hallway in your story, I've walked through it. I turned left when I shouldn't have. I think something followed me." She read the comment twice and bookmarked it. That week, Hannah began receiving letters again. Not emails, physical letters with strange stamps, unfamiliar postmarks, and handwriting that pulsed with urgency. Some were just single sentences. "He said I wasn't ready, but you could help." Others were elaborate, full accounts of impossible experiences, disappearances, slips in time, returning to childhood homes to find they'd never existed. One envelope contained only a photograph of a girl in a red yukata standing at the edge of a riverbank, her face turned slightly just enough for Hannah to recognize her. Another had a dried cherry blossom folded inside, and the words, "It bloomed in December, and I remembered you." She kept every letter. Some nights, unable to sleep, she would spread them out across her floor like tarot cards. Patterns began to form, names recurring, places mentioned across continents, symbols repeated. She sketched them in the back of her journal, the circle, the crossed lines, the inverted gate. They weren't merely glyphs, they were invitations, coordinates, rituals passed from memory into myth, into belief. The more she wrote, the clearer it became. The Yamashiro Inn was not unique. It was a node in a web, an ancient one connecting liminal spaces across the world, a network of thinning veils, and perhaps she feared she had become one of its threads. One evening in early spring, Hannah was on her way home from a rare outing, a solitary dinner at a quiet soba shop, when she passed a bookstore she didn't remember ever seeing. It wasn't lit from within, and the sign above was faded to illegibility, but the door was open. She paused. Something about the doorway shimmered not with light, but with expectation. She entered. Inside the store smelled of cedar and ink. There was no clerk, no music, just rows upon rows of books, each one handwritten, bound in soft leather or stitched rice paper. No two spines were alike. She wandered in silence until a particular book caught her eye, not because it was new, but because it bore a familiar name etched faintly on the spine. Kyuko. Her breath caught. The book was thin, delicate. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were pages she didn't remember writing, but recognized all the same scenes of her grandmother, as a child alone at the inn, the first time she heard the name Yamashiro whispered through the walls. The ink was faded, but it was her voice, her structure, her rhythm. She turned another page. There a single line. "We are remembered by those who choose to carry our stories, not by those who fear them." A bell rang behind her. She turned, expecting to see someone. But the door stood open, the street visible through it. Sunlight poured in. When she looked back at the shelf, the book was gone. She left the shop in a daze, walking home on unsteady legs. As she crossed the bridge near her apartment, she glanced at the river below. And for a single moment, she saw them reflections of people who weren't there. A woman in a green kimono holding an oil paper umbrella. A boy in school uniform reading a book with no title. A man with no face. And in the very back, standing at the bank, the girl in the red yukata. They weren't watching her. They were watching each other. That night she didn't dream, but when she woke, a fresh page lay on her desk. Blank. Waiting. Hannah stared at the blank page for what felt like hours. Morning sun crept through her window, illuminating dust motes in the air, but the page remained untouched, unclaimed. It wasn't that she had nothing to write. On the contrary, the stories pressed against her temples like waves ready to break. But the silence around her had changed. It wasn't emptiness, it was listening. The air felt poised, patient, as if the very space of her apartment had become a room within the inn itself, holding its breath. Eventually, she dipped her pen and began not from a place of inspiration, but of obligation, a sacred duty. There are places that remember us, even when we forget ourselves. They are not haunted in the way we tell stories of ghosts. They are haunted by memory itself, by every choice that splintered reality, just enough to open a doorway. And once opened, those doorways do not close. They wait. The ink bled a little at the corner of the page, forming a curve that resembled the symbol she kept seeing in dreams, a looped gate, a mirror turned inward. She kept writing. This time her hands moved with certainty. The tale that emerged wasn't hers, but it was familiar. A woman named Aiko, traveling alone to a mountain temple after her husband's death. A guide who only spoke in riddles, a lantern that wouldn't stay lit, a bell that rang only when she turned away. The temple wasn't the Yamashiro Inn, but it echoed the same architecture sliding paper doors that led to places that didn't make sense meals, that reappeared uneaten no matter how many times you cleared the tray, a sense of being watched by a version of yourself you hadn't yet become. It was fiction, she told herself. But it came too easily, the details too crisp. She could smell the incense, feel the chill of the floor beneath Aiko's bare feet. And the final scene, Aiko standing before a mirror, where her reflection bowed and then walked away on its own left, Hana shaken. Not because of the image, but because it mirrored a dream she hadn't shared with anyone. She closed the notebook, heart pounding. Outside, the light had shifted. It was nearly dusk. Time had slipped again, just like it used to at the inn. The next day, an envelope slid under her door. No stamp, no writing. Just a wax seal with the familiar gate-shaped emblem pressed deep into the red. Inside was a single sheet of thick parchment. You're ready to choose. She didn't know what it meant. Not at first. But as night fell, and the wind began to sing through the cracks in her windows, she understood. The stories weren't just bleeding into reality anymore. They were beginning to ask something of her. She thought about the letters she'd received, the voices in the comments, begging her to finish the tale, the dreams that had grown more vivid. Some readers had stopped replying entirely. Their names disappeared from the forum. She feared she knew why. She returned to the old journal and searched the margins, the gaps between stories. There, hidden like fingerprints between lines, she found them tiny notations in faded gray ink coordinates, fragments of addresses, sometimes just names. She traced them to libraries that had burned down decades ago, boarding schools closed due to structural instability, spas, and resorts that had once promised spiritual cleansing before mysteriously shuttering. Every place had one thing in common. They had all been built on older foundations, shrines, ritual sites, inns. There had never been just one Yamashiro. It was a mask worn by countless places over time, a conduit, a gathering space for grief so potent it became sentient, and she somehow had become its newest curator. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Not the front door, the bathroom. The air turned electric. She approached slowly, breath shallow. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the mirror was fogged despite no hot water running. As she leaned in, something shifted behind the condensation. Not her reflection, but a corridor, lit by dim lanterns. Tatami underfoot. She could almost hear the faint thump of drums in the distance. Room 7 waited, and for the first time in weeks, Hana wasn't afraid. She reached out. Her fingers touched the glass. It rippled. Then, stillness. She stepped back. The mirror showed only her. Pale, steady, awake. She didn't pass through. Not yet. That night, she packed a small bag, tea notebooks, the red yukata, the letters. She didn't know where she would go, not exactly. but she followed the trail of ink of memory of names left behind like breadcrumbs. She would find the next inn, the next threshold, and she would write until it remembered her. The story wasn't finished, but the door was open. The train cut through the countryside like a silent blade, gliding past frost-tipped fields and villages folded beneath low clouds. Hannah sat by the window, notebook in her lap, eyes unfocused. She wasn't writing. Not yet. Her pen hovered above the paper like a divining rod, waiting for the earth to whisper. Around her, the carriage was empty, save for a sleeping man. A few rows ahead, his face turned to the aisle. The conductor hadn't checked her ticket. The usual announcements never played. It was as if the journey itself existed outside of time, suspended between two realities, one remembered, one not yet born. She watched her reflection melt into the scenery layers of her face, dissolving into mountains and telephone poles, until even her own outline began to fade. She didn't mind. She'd grown used to this kind of slow vanishing. Since the letter with the wax seal reality had become malleable. She'd wake in her apartment and hear the call of crows that didn't exist in her district, or smell sandalwood incense curling through vents long sealed. The transition had begun, and she knew this trip would not be a visit. It would be an arrival. The train stopped without announcement at a station she didn't recognize. No signs, no clock, just a narrow platform wrapped in mist. Hannah stepped off, shoes crunching on wet gravel. The train doors closed behind her, and without a sound, the train slipped away. She stood there, alone. Or nearly alone. A lantern glowed near the edge of the forest, where a stone path curled into the trees. Beneath the lantern, an elderly woman sat behind a small stand, brushing something invisible off a guest ledger. Her face was partially obscured by a scarf, but her voice was unmistakable. "I wondered when you'd come." It was not her grandmother's voice, but it carried the same gravity, weighted with memory, truth in disguise. "I don't have a reservation," Hannah replied, stepping closer. The woman chuckled without humor. "No one ever does. But the inn remembers who's next." She gestured down the path, straight through the pines. "You'll know when you've arrived. No map, no explanation, only an invitation wrapped in inevitability." The forest swallowed her with quiet grace. As she walked, the trees pressed closer. The mist deepened. Her feet followed the curve of the stones, not by sight, but instinct. Each bend in the trail unveiled another fragment of memory, the scent of rain on cedar, the hollow knock of wood underfoot, the sound of distant singing. No words, just a melody that ached with familiarity. When she finally reached the clearing, the structure waiting there stole her breath. It was not the Yamashiro Inn. Not exactly. This place was older and yet somehow newer, as if the inn had molted and been reborn. The architecture bore a regional signature she didn't recognize, northern colder, but the soul of it was the same. The curve of the eaves, the arrangement of lanterns, the door slightly ajar as though it had been waiting for her alone. Inside, the air hummed with a low warmth. Lantern light flickered along lacquered beams. The scent of sakura petals hung in the air, out of season, but strong. As she passed through the lobby, her footsteps made no sound. The check-in book lay open on the counter, pen poised. She didn't sign it. She didn't have to. Her room was ready. Second floor. End of the hall. Room 7. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The room looked as she remembered, futon, neatly arranged window, partially open to the garden below, a steaming teapot set on the tray as if someone had known her exact arrival time. But there was something new, a mirror above the low dresser that hadn't been there before. She approached it slowly. The reflection showed her, but not alone. Behind her, standing at the threshold, was a figure in red. She turned. No one. When she looked back, the figure was closer. The girl in the red yukata didn't move, didn't blink. Her face was smooth, ageless, unreadable, but her eyes held stories, centuries of them. Hannah stepped forward until their reflections almost touched. The girl reached up slowly and pressed her palm to the mirror. Hannah mirrored the gesture. The glass grew cold beneath her skin, then soft. Her hand passed through. For the first time since she had walked away from the original Yamashiro Inn, Hannah felt it. Not fear, not wonder, but return, completion. She stepped into the mirror, into the reflection. The room behind her faded, the inn dissolved, and the next story began. It was not darkness she entered, but something far stranger light, without source space, without form. Hannah stood in a realm suspended between breath and memory, a corridor of shifting boundaries. The air here moved like water, yet it didn't cling. It simply passed over her, whispering fragments of voices, long silent. She walked forward because she had no choice, because forward was the only direction that didn't echo. The corridor narrowed as she moved, walls forming themselves out of suggestion. Sometimes paper, sometimes stone. Her hand brushed along textures that changed without pattern. Tatami that pulsed like skinwood grain, that hummed like low music. She came to a door. No markings, no handle, just a threshold. She stepped through and found herself in a room that felt familiar, not because she'd seen it, but because she had dreamed of it for years. It was the waiting room from the old Yamashiro Inn, but stretched and altered as if seen through a rain-blurred lens. The paper lanterns were lit, casting shadows that moved even when she stood still. The low table bore an empty teacup, her teacup. The same small chip along the rim, the faint stain of oolong at the base. She hadn't used this cup in years, not since her grandmother's funeral. The girl in red was waiting, not standing this time, but kneeling beside the table, hands folded in her lap. Her head tilted slightly, the same unreadable expression on her face. This time she spoke. "You're writing again," Hannah swallowed. "Yes." "And dreaming more than you used to?" "Yes." The girl nodded. "Then the time has come to remember what you've forgotten." The walls began to breathe. Slowly at first, then with more urgency, as if the room itself prepared to exhale something it had held too long. The lanterns flickered. Shadows stretched. And from the corners of the room, doors began to appear, 7 of them, each identical, evenly spaced. The girl gestured to them. "One of these holds your true memory, the moment your story truly began. The others are misdirection. Walk through the wrong door, and you may not find your way back." Hannah stepped forward, heart steady but slow. The doors pulsed faintly like they were alive. She tried to read them, not with her eyes, but with instinct, with intuition honed by years of writing, of remembering what others forgot. Her hand hovered over the 3rd door. Cold. The 5th numb. The 6th warm. But the 7th, a flicker of grief. The sharp bite of fresh snow. A bell ringing in the distance. She chose the 7th. As she passed through the door, didn't swing or open, it simply ceased to exist, and she stepped into a winter field under moonlight. Snow fell silently, each flake pausing mid-air before continuing its descent. She was barefoot, but not cold. Before her stood a house, old rotting edges crumbling like soaked parchment. But she knew it. Her childhood home. Not the way it had looked in photos, but the way it had appeared in the memory she had always avoided the night her mother disappeared. She walked through the threshold. The inside was hollowed out. Walls stained with water damage. Furniture draped in white sheets. The air was thick with absence. She ascended the stairs. Each step creaked with the weight of memory. Her hand brushed the banister, the same place where her mother had once placed her own, guiding Hannah to bed after her first fever. The door at the top was ajar. She pushed it open. Inside the room was preserved in exacting detail. A child's room. Her room. Toys scattered, picture books stacked unevenly, a window painted shut. On the bed sat a woman, her back to Hannah, hair pinned in a bun that trembled with each breath she took. Hannah didn't need to see her face. She knew. "Mom," she whispered. The woman turned. Her eyes were distant, rimmed with sleep or sorrow. But she smiled. "I was waiting for you to remember." Tears welled unbidden. "Why did you leave?" "I didn't," her mother replied softly. "You just forgot where I went." And then the room changed. The walls cracked open like eggshells. Light burst from beneath the floor. The ceiling stretched upward, dissolving into a sky painted in strokes of black and crimson. The bed vanished. Her mother stood now at the center of a spiraling garden path, and Hannah followed. They walked together, not speaking, until they reached a pond so still it reflected the stars not yet born. Her mother pointed to the surface. "Look," Hannah leaned in. The reflection was not of the garden, but of the inn. Not as it had been, but as it was now, alive, breathing, shifting through centuries. Guests arrived and vanished. Staff never aged. Rituals repeated. And in the middle of it all, Hannah always writing. "This is what you've built," her mother said. "A house made of memory. But you must decide, do you continue to be its guest, or do you become its keeper?" The water shimmered. From behind them, the girl in red waited again. The choice was near. The pond rippled with a breathless stillness, as if waiting for Hannah's answer. Her mother stood beside her, fading not in shape, but in weight, like mist slowly lifting from a field. The girl in red remained behind them, silent and patient, her presence no longer ominous, but essential, like a hinge on which something vast depended. Hannah looked down once more, watching her own reflection move independently. It raised its head first, then turned toward her eyes, dark with knowing. And then, without ceremony, it stepped away from the water's surface and into the inn. Her breath caught. The reflection had chosen. "I didn't come here to be a guardian," Hannah murmured almost to herself. "No." Her mother replied gently. "You came here because stories brought you. But some stories don't just want to be told, they want to live. And they need someone to carry them forward." Hannah glanced at the girl, whose expression hadn't changed. But something in the air around her did. A subtle tightening. A hush that stretched into understanding. The garden, the pond her mother they were. Pages turning, chapters ending. What lay ahead wasn't a return to the old Yamashiro Inn, or a resurrection of her grandmother's voice. It was something entirely new, seeded from the past, but growing into something else. She turned from the water and walked back toward the threshold from which she came. Not the forest trail, not the train, but a path now forming before her, one that led between towering torii gates, carved from stone, blackened with age. Each step felt heavier, the weight of memory anchoring her in place, and yet she moved forward with increasing clarity. The torii gates were not symbolic. They were passageways, veils between the fractured echoes of time and the bones of something eternal. As she passed under the final gate, the inn rose before her once again, but it was different now. Larger, infinite, in a way the human mind could barely contain. Its corridors twisted like thought, its rooms rearranged with need. Lanterns blinked like distant stars. And above it all, high in a watchtower wrapped in paper and prayer scrolls, was a window with no glass, just an opening through which wind poured secrets into the night. Hannah entered through the main doors. The lobby greeted her with silence, though it was filled with activity just beyond her view. Footsteps echoed from upper floors. Soft voices murmured behind screens, and somewhere deeper in the inn, a biwa played a lonely tune. She followed the sound. Down unfamiliar hallways that folded in on themselves, she found a writing desk placed at the center of a circular chamber. The walls were made of books, old bound in skin and bark, and cloth pulsing gently like slumbering hearts. At the desk sat an old man. He didn't look up. "You're late," he said, voice low, scratchy, like the turning of a page. But then again, all stories arrive exactly when they're supposed to. "Who are you?" Hannah asked. The man dipped his brush in ink and began writing in a book with no title. "A placeholder. Someone kept this chair warm while you were deciding." She stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. The characters on the page shimmered, rearranging themselves into different languages, names she recognized, guests she'd written about, places she'd dreamed of but never visited. Every name was a soul, every story a thread. The man stood slowly back, creaking, and turned to her with hollow eyes. "The chair is yours now. But know this, it's not just ink you'll be writing with. Every choice will cost you memory. Every tale you commit will take something you once held dear." Hannah looked at the chair. It was plain, worn, comfortable. The kind of seat you forget you're sitting in after hours of writing. But the desk before it was endless. A scroll unrolled across its surface, blank, and waiting, humming faintly with the breath of unborn stories. She sat. The man bowed once, then faded into the shadows between bookshelves. The girl in red entered through the far door and placed a teacup beside her. This time, she spoke not as a guide or guardian, but as kin. "Welcome, innkeeper." The lanterns brightened. Hannah dipped the brush into ink that shimmered like starlight. She pressed it to the scroll, and the first line appeared not in words, but in emotion. "Longing, sorrow, wonder," she wrote, and outside the inn, in 1,000 dreamscapes, 1,000 listeners stirred in their sleep, drawn to a whisper in the dark. A whisper shaped like their own fears, hopes, and forgotten memories. A whisper telling them, "There is a place for you here." And now it had a keeper. Time inside the inn bent differently now. Hours didn't pass. They accumulated, layered like the pages of a story unfinished. Hannah no longer marked her days with sunrises or sunsets. She marked them by the stories she wrote, and the ones that wrote her back. Some nights the guests came silently slipping into their rooms as if they had always lived here. Others arrived drenched in storm and memory, clutching fragments of their lives as though fearing they would dissolve if released. She welcomed them all not as a hostess with scripted smiles, but as a witness. She did not judge. She did not comfort. She simply listened and remembered. There were rules, though. No one had ever written them. Some guests stayed only one night and left lighter. Some never left at all. And some, the rare ones, brought more with them than they had ever taken out into the world. These were the dangerous ones, the storytellers who had wandered too close to truth, who had opened doors in search of inspiration and found instead a mirror they could not look away from. Hannah knew them by their eyes. They all looked like they were mid-sentence. One such guest arrived on the 6th day of the harvest cycle. He was tall, thin, dressed in outdated traveling clothes that hadn't been fashionable for decades. His suitcase was locked with 3 latches each, marked with a symbol Hannah instinctively recognized, forgetting erasure silence. He didn't give a name, simply asked for room 5, which hadn't been opened since Hannah arrived. She hesitated, but nodded. When she brought him his tea, he didn't drink it. He placed a notebook on the floor between them and said, "I've come to give this back." The notebook was old, familiar. She reached for it slowly, hands trembling. It was her handwriting. The stories inside weren't ones she remembered writing. Some were versions of dreams she'd had as a child. Others described places she'd never visited, but had imagined with uncanny accuracy. The limestone well in her grandmother's village, the red bridge across the hidden river in the north, the stone steps where she'd once seen a girl who didn't blink. Each page pulsed with a strange warmth, like the ink itself still breathed. At the end of the final entry, a line had been added in a different hand. Some stories don't wait to be written. They find you, again and again. She looked up. The man was gone. The notebook remained. Later, she would learn that room 5 had no windows. The mirror inside was shattered. The futon had never been slept in, and yet, when she returned the next morning to clean, the teacup was empty. Hannah added the notebook to the library, not on the shelf, but to a locked drawer beneath her desk. She didn't read from it again. She didn't need to. The words had already threaded themselves into her blood. That night, the wind shifted. It blew from the north where the pines leaned in hushed reverence, and the foxes spoke in riddles. Something approached. At midnight, the chime above the door rang, not the soft jingle of new guests, but the deeper resonance of one returning. The girl in red entered once more, but this time she wore something different, a black kimono embroidered with silver thread in the pattern of waves. Her face was older, not in years, but in gravity. The room around her dimmed, like the very lanterns bowed to her presence. "It's time," she said simply, for what Hannah asked, though she already knew, to write the story that will unmake the inn. The brush slipped from Hannah's fingers. "The story isn't done," she whispered. "There are still so many waiting. There always will be. That's why it must end. So it can begin again. Somewhere else. In someone else." The walls creaked. A hush fell over the floorboards. The inn, sensing its own twilight, seemed to sigh. Outside, snow began to fall. Hannah stood walking to the window. The garden was still, the koi pond frozen. In the courtyard, shadowed figures, past guests, perhaps stood in silent vigil. The final tale would not be hers alone. She returned to the desk, unrolled a fresh scroll, and dipped her brush. The ink clung to the bristles with reluctance, as though aware of what was to come. She began to write. In a house shaped by memory, where stories sleep beneath the floorboards and dreams speak through the wind, a woman once became a keeper. But even keepers must close the book someday. Even stories must be allowed to rest. The ink flowed easily now, guided by something deeper than thought. The room faded. The walls bled into fog. The floor opened into stars, and still she wrote. The ink curved into characters that shimmered faintly, as if resisting permanence, each stroke a thread, tying one world to the next. Hannah's hand moved without hesitation, now driven by something older than instinct, something bone deep. The room around her dissolved into abstraction, not darkness, but a kind of silence, so complete it swallowed the notion of space. The girl in the black kimono watched without expression, a figure of stillness in a world unraveling. As the final paragraph formed, a distant sound echoed through the silence paper, flapping like wings or pages turning in a storm. The inn itself responded. Walls trembled gently, beams groaned with tired dignity. It wasn't a collapse. It was a yielding, an ancient being preparing for metamorphosis. "You're not afraid?" the girl asked, voice soft but certain. "I am," Hannah replied, not looking up. "But fear isn't the same as regret." The girl nodded once, then crossed the floor to the shelves that now seemed impossibly tall. With one gloved hand, she drew a book down, not by title or cover, but by weight. She handed it to Hannah. "Yours," she said. "From before, when you didn't know who you were." Hannah opened it slowly. Inside were only blank pages, not empty, blank. As if they had been read too many times and the ink had faded away under the pressure of memory. "This was the first book I lost," she whispered. "And the last one you'll write," the girl answered. "But not here. Not now." Around them, the inn began to flicker. Not just the lights or the lanterns, but the very idea of walls of doorways of time. Rooms became reflections. Hallways melted into dreams. The great staircase spiraled upward endlessly into a ceiling that no longer held anything above it. Guests stood still in their places, some with hands clasped, others weeping silently, one child holding a paper fox. None of them moved to leave. None seemed surprised. Hannah placed the brush down. The scroll rolled itself with care, as if aware of its burden. She stood holding it in her arms like a newborn. "What now?" she asked. The girl stepped toward her, and for the first time took her hand. "We walk out the same way we came in, but I came through a mirror." The girl smiled faintly. "And that mirror was a door, remember? And all doors open both ways." Together, they stepped toward the far end of the writing chamber, where a simple Norran curtain now hung painted with a single character, Jong End. As they passed through, the inn didn't vanish, it exhaled. The breath of centuries released into the wind, carrying the scents of ink and cedar and candle smoke into the eternal void. Beyond the curtain, Hannah stood once more, in the field of snow where it had all begun. But this time, no frost clung to her. Her footprints didn't sink. The house in the distance, the one she thought she'd imagined as a child, was whole again. Warm lights flickered behind the shoji screens. A faint hum of song drifted from its walls. She turned to look for the girl in black, but she was already gone. Instead, on the stone beside her lay the notebook with her name pressed into its leather. She opened it, and this time the pages were not blank. They were full of stories yet to happen, names she didn't know, places she had never seen. But they waited for her voice, her hands, her quiet. A breeze passed through the field, and she heard it again, that low, aching music, the kind only heard by those who write not to be known, but to understand. She stepped forward, and the snow did not resist. The path through the snow wound toward the house like a memory retraced, not straight, but sure. Hannah moved slowly, not out of hesitation, but reverence. Each step stirred something beneath the surface of the snow. Not footprints, but echoes reverberating into the ground, sending ripples through the earth that only stories could follow. The light from the house glowed warmer as she approached, like it recognized her, like it had waited not just for a return, but for a remembering. When she reached the porch, she paused. The door wasn't shut. It stood slightly ajar, as though it had always expected her to cross the threshold again. Her hand pressed against the wood. It felt neither cold nor warm, just present, worn smooth by the passing of many hands over many years. She stepped inside. The scent struck her first, a blend of tatami old ink, roasted barley tea, and something older like sandalwood smoldering deep within the walls. It was a house that had been lived in, abandoned, dreamed of, and now reclaimed. The floors creaked gently under her, not from disrepair, but from recognition. She passed the entryway, where once a younger version of herself had thrown off snow-covered boots, ran barefoot down the corridor, her voice calling out for a mother who no longer answered. But tonight there was no fear in these walls. The living room was exactly as she remembered, yet altered in subtle ways. The books had returned to their shelves, but some bore new titles. The kettle on the stove steamed as if someone had just boiled water. On the low table lay a cup not filled, but waiting. She walked past it and toward the old study at the rear of the house, a room she'd always been forbidden from entering. As a child, that mystery had tormented her. She'd often crouched by the paper-thin sliding door, listening to hushed voices, the scratch of pen on paper, the fluttering of documents being arranged and rearranged. Her mother had once told her, "Some rooms only open when you stop trying to unlock them." Now it opened without resistance. Inside the study was bathed in amber light. Candles burned steadily, undisturbed by the draft. The walls were lined with scrolls and records photos and clippings. But at the center of the room stood a desk, simple, elegant lacquered black, topped with a bound ledger and an inkwell untouched for decades. Hannah approached, drawn to the object, with a certainty that hummed beneath her skin. She opened the ledger. Inside were names. Each name carried weight. She didn't recognize them all, but she felt their significance. Some were guests who had passed through the inn in dreams and stories. Others were writers, scribes, recorders of truth and imagination alike. But one name had no ink, only an indentation, as if someone had pressed their pen to the page but never committed the word. Her name. She picked up the brush resting beside the book, and with slow deliberation dipped it into the ink. The black liquid clung to the bristles like gravity itself. With a steady hand, she wrote, Hana Ishikawa. As she lifted the brush, the candles flickered. The room shivered, not from fear, but from completion. Somewhere in the house, a wind chime rang, once then stilled. Behind her, a voice spoke not from the doorway, not from shadow, but from memory made manifest. You found the beginning again. She turned and found the old woman standing there. Her hair bound in silver braids, her robes layered like leaves, her eyes deep and serene. It was not just her grandmother. It was every elder before her, every keeper who had borne the stories when no one else would. Was I always meant to return? Hannah asked. The woman nodded slowly. No one is meant, but some are called and some answer. And the inn, it still exists within you, within those who dream of it. Its form will change, but its soul is yours now. The woman stepped forward, and for a fleeting moment, placed her hands over Hannah's. They were warm grounding. Then, like mist touched by morning sun, she faded, leaving behind only the pressure of her presence and the faint scent of lavender and cedarwood. Hannah stood alone in the study, but she didn't feel alone. She walked to the window and opened it. The snow had stopped. The sky above was deep blue, scattered with stars so bright they shimmered like punctuation in the night's final sentence. She didn't need to return to the inn. It was already where it needed to be, every time someone remembered, wrote, or dreamed of it. Now her task was simpler, but no less sacred, to tell the stories that others feared to speak, to write the memories that never made it into photographs, to hold the weight of voices that the world had forgotten. And when the time came, she would leave behind not just words, but a map made of ink and silence and wonder for the next keeper to follow. Hannah spent the following weeks in quiet ritual, not bound by instruction, but by an instinct that had grown sharp through sleepless nights and whispered names. Mornings were spent transcribing fading memories from journals, found tucked inside hollow floorboards and cracked walls left by keepers before her. Afternoons drifted into readings of scrolls that hummed with dormant voices, some comforting, others more volatile, like they resented being awoken. But it was in the deep stillness of night, when the house fell into breathless slumber, that her real work began. Seated at the black lacquered desk, she would listen not with her ears, but with something deeper. The voices came slowly at first, disjointed, cryptic, like the wind muttering through keyholes. But soon they formed into fragments of tales, unfinished stories, too heavy for their speakers to carry alone. She never forced them. She waited, and when they were ready, they poured through her. One night, as a storm murmured in the distance, Hannah felt something shift. It wasn't dramatic, a creak in the wood, the soft collapse of snow from the roof, but it carried weight like a curtain lifting from a hidden window. She walked through the house barefoot, guided only by instinct and memory, until she reached the attic ladder she had once been too frightened to climb. It was strange how time transformed fear into familiarity. Each rung groaned beneath her, as she ascended not in protest but in recognition. At the top, the trapdoor opened with a sigh. The attic was dim, dust-laced air hanging thick like a memory long buried. Moonlight filtered through a small square window, illuminating a single trunk in the center of the room. Its surface was worn smooth by age, the lock rusted but loosely clasped, as though it no longer believed in its purpose. Hana knelt before it, fingers brushing over the lid. She undid the clasp. Inside, wrapped in linen stained by time, was a collection of drawings. Ink sketches, charcoal etchings, some detailed and others only suggested snapshots of the inn in various forms, changing subtly across generations. One drawing struck her hardest, a girl at a writing desk, her back turned, a single candle flickering by her side. But it wasn't her. The girl's hair was longer, her robe unfamiliar. On the edge of the paper, written in brush calligraphy, was a name: Aiko Ishikawa, her great-grandmother. Beneath the drawings lay a narrow scroll bound with red thread. She hesitated before untying it. The fabric released without resistance. The writing inside was neat, patient, deliberate. Aiko's hand. The scroll was not a story, it was a letter. To the one who returns, it began. If you are reading this, the inn has chosen you, not as a guest, not as a witness, but as the bearer. You may wonder why it falls to you. The truth is, we are not chosen because we are ready. We are chosen because we remember. The inn survives only through memory, and memory, like story, is a living thing. It needs a place to be kept. We are that place. The scroll continued, a mixture of advice and farewell warnings and wisdom. Aiko spoke of guests who came without names, of stories that resisted being told, of nights where even the fire refused to burn. But most of all, she spoke of the end, an end she had felt approaching but had never reached. One day the story will come full circle. When it does, you must not fear it. Let it close, and then let it open again. Hana reread the line 3 times. Not fear it. Let it close. Let it open again. She understood now that the inn, like memory itself, was never permanent in form. It was a cycle passed through blood and silence, kept alive only by those willing to listen and to let go. She rolled the scroll back up and carried it with her down the ladder, the words still warm against her palm. She returned to the study and placed the scroll beside her ledger. The wind had picked up again outside, brushing along the eaves of the house like fingers dragging across chimes. But Hana didn't shiver. She poured herself a cup of tea and returned to the desk. Before her lay an empty scroll. She looked at the brush, then at the quiet window beyond. Somewhere, perhaps just outside her sight, a new guest had begun walking down a forgotten path, guided only by instinct and the pull of something old. She dipped the brush in ink and wrote the opening line. This is a story that begins at its ending. The storm deepened outside. But inside the house, the silence was no longer empty. It was full of voices waiting, watching, ready to be remembered. The snowstorm that night did not howl or rage, it whispered. Fine flakes drifted sideways like a slow-moving veil settling against the windows in a quiet hush, as if the entire landscape held its breath. Hana continued writing, her hand steady, the rhythm of her brush against parchment as natural as a heartbeat. The words didn't flow from thought, but from memory, layered within memory, impressions gathered over years she hadn't consciously lived. The new story she had begun was not merely a tale, it was a bridge binding past and future in delicate balance. She wrote of a traveler with no face who arrived at an inn that stood between seasons. She wrote of rooms that changed shape depending on who entered them, of teacups that remembered the hands that held them, and of dreams that began only once their dreamer awoke. It wasn't fiction. It was truth wearing a mask. Outside, the The snow thickened. The woods beyond the garden disappeared behind a curtain of white. Somewhere within that whiteness, an old gate stood half-sunken, its posts bowed from time and neglect. Hannah had seen it once as a child and never returned until now. She paused in her writing, folded the unfinished scroll, and stood. She dressed not in her heaviest robes, but in her warmest worn garments clothing that had walked with her through grief and silence. Then, without a lantern, she stepped outside into the snow. The world was changed. The path she'd known as a girl was gone, replaced by something older. The trees loomed taller, their branches laced with frost like veins of silver in petrified wood. The silence out here was different from that in the house. It wasn't listening, it was waiting. She made her way to the gate, slowly, feet sinking into untouched snow. No one had passed this way for decades, and yet the air held a strange familiarity, as if she were walking into a memory that had patiently been saving her place. The gate still stood, but just barely. Its wood splintered, moss-covered, inscribed with kanji half-erased by time. To those who seek, but do not ask. She passed under it. Beyond the gate, the world shifted again. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. But the snow no longer fell. The air turned warmer, dense with the scent of plum blossoms and damp earth. The trees no longer bore frost, but red leaves and curling vines. It was neither winter nor spring, but something in between, a season that existed only here in this place, forgotten by maps. She walked further until the trees gave way to a clearing. In the center stood a second inn. It was smaller than the one she'd known, humbler. The roof sagged slightly. The porch creaked in the wind. Yet its presence was undeniable, firm old, and deeply still. A soft light glowed from within, golden and pulsing like breath. Hannah stepped closer and felt it before she reached the steps. This inn was not hers. It belonged to someone else. Yet it waited for her all the same. On the door hung a wooden tag. No names, no symbols. Just a circle brushed with a single stroke unbroken fluid. She raised her hand to knock, but hesitated. From within, footsteps approached. The door opened. A man stood in the threshold, middle-aged, his features plain, except for his eyes that had seen everything. He looked at her with no surprise, as though he had been expecting her his whole life. He stepped aside without a word, gesturing for her to enter. Inside the room was almost empty. One table, 2 cups, a teapot already steaming. No scrolls, no books, no visible history. Just presence. The man gestured to the cushion. She sat. He poured tea. They drank in silence. After a long moment, he finally spoke. "You've brought it, haven't you?" She nodded slowly, then produced the folded scroll from inside her robe. She laid it on the table without unrolling it. The man didn't touch it. He simply looked at it, as though reading every word through the cloth. "I wasn't sure you'd find the gate," he said. "I didn't," she answered. "It found me." He smiled, faint and distant, as it should be. "What is this place?" she asked. "It feels like the other inn, but also not." He set his cup down carefully. "This is where stories come when they're ready to end, not the inn. The stories themselves. Some return here. Some are reborn. Some are finally allowed to forget. And mine." He looked at her again, and this time she saw the weight behind his stillness. "Yours is still being written." He reached for the scroll, gently as one might lift a child. "This story won't stay here," he said, "but it must pass through. Everything must pass through just once." As he unfurled the parchment, a warm wind stirred the paper, rustling it gently. Hannah closed her eyes, and for the first time she heard the ending begin. The sound wasn't music exactly. It was the hush between notes, the way silence bends just before something profound is said. As the scroll fully unrolled on the table between them, Hana saw not her handwriting alone, but others layered beneath it. Ghost ink, fading yet present, like generations, whispering through the same page. Names, places, moments, each one incomplete, as though waiting for her to finish what they could not. The man across from her traced one of the names with his fingertip. "This one came before me," he murmured. She stayed until her voice was gone. Then with reverence, he rolled the scroll again and handed it back to her. "You'll need to return before the snow melts," he said, rising. "The gate only stays open so long, and stories left outside too long become something else." "What happens if I don't go back?" she asked. Though the answer already stirred uneasily inside her, he tilted his head, thoughtful. "Then you'll be remembered in fragments scattered across pages no one finishes. Your story will unravel into other people's dreams. Not lost, but never truly yours again." She stood clutching the scroll. The inn around her seemed smaller now, almost folding in on itself like a paper lantern after the flame dies out. She followed him to the door, and there, just beyond the threshold, the forest waited unchanged. But the snow was returning slow at first, then thicker, heavier. She took a step back into the world she came from. The trees closed behind her like a memory fading. The gate welcomed her again, and when she passed through it, the scent of frost returned. The snow was ankle-deep now, but she moved quickly, retracing the path toward her home, guided by the dim glow of her inn's lanterns, warm and flickering in the dusk. When she crossed the threshold of her own house, the sense of time resumed like a breath drawn after too long underwater. Inside, everything was still. The candles had not burned down. The tea was still warm, yet the scroll she carried now pulsed faintly like something alive. She placed it upon the desk, sat before it, and waited. There was no voice, no wind, no ghost, only a presence, a stillness that pressed gently at her back, coaxing her to continue. She unrolled a fresh parchment, dipped her brush in ink, and began again, not where she had left off, but somewhere older, somewhere deeper. This story was not just hers. It belonged to the inn, to the guests who came in dreams, to the keepers who watched quietly through the folds of time. It was a record of thresholds, crossed of gates, opened and closed of truths too heavy to carry alone. Hours passed. The night deepened. The storm fell into rhythm with her brushstrokes, and somewhere in a space beyond the written word, the ending that had been waiting began to unfold. Not with a scream, not with a cry, but with a quiet sentence that shimmered like breath on glass. Some stories are not meant to be understood. They are meant to be remembered. That sentence lingered in the air, not as something spoken, but as something known, etched into the bones of the house itself. Hana paused, the brush hovering above the parchment, its tip heavy with ink, trembling slightly in her grip. The quiet around her was not silence anymore. It was a tapestry of everything unsaid. The rustle of ancient paper, the footfalls of visitors long vanished, the creak of floorboards remembering weight that had long since departed. She dipped the brush again and continued, not thinking, not planning, only following a current that pulled her deeper into the story, deeper into the house, deeper into herself. In the margins, she began to sketch not images of the inn she saw, but of one that didn't yet exist, a corridor without walls that led to a door made of obsidian glass, a room suspended in mist, a guest with no face who always knocked 3 times. Her hand moved faster. Every page she filled seemed to unearth another beneath it, like layers of earth revealing relics. She wrote of sorrow and of comfort, of loneliness, transformed into refuge. She wrote of a girl who became a house of a house that became a memory of a memory that refused to die. And still, she wrote. The candlelight flickered once, not from wind, but from breath. She turned her head slowly, and in the doorway stood a figure not threatening, not even fully there. More a silhouette shaped by longing. The outline was familiar: high cheekbones, slender shoulders, hair bound in a loose braid. Her mother. Not as Hannah last saw her, frail and quiet in a hospital bed, but as she remembered her best, standing tall in the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes always half filled with thought. They stared at each other, unmoving, and for the first time in years, Hannah did not feel the urge to speak. She only smiled. Her mother returned the gesture, and with it came the sound of a sigh that hadn't been released in over a decade. The figure stepped back, fading with each movement, leaving warmth in her place. A clock chimed. The hour was late, but time had no hold here anymore. Hannah returned to the scroll. As her brush reached the final line, the ink began to change, dark at first, then shimmering faintly, with a hue not found in any ordinary palette. It pulsed softly, like the scroll had taken on a heartbeat. She watched it for a long moment, then carefully folded the parchment and placed it inside a box carved with symbols she did not understand, yet instinctively trusted. She stood and crossed to the hearth. A fire she did not light now burned steadily, casting long shadows that danced up the walls and along the beams. She placed the box on the mantel beside the old ledger. It was not an offering nor a surrender. It was simply a continuation. Outside, the snow had stopped. The moon cast silver lines across the frozen ground, and the trees shimmered as if dusted with crushed crystal. Somewhere in the forest, the gate stood closed again, but she felt no urgency to pass through it. Tonight, the inn was full, not with guests of flesh and blood, but with presence. Every room held someone's echo. The chair in the corner knew the weight of an old man who once waited for a letter. The kitchen remembered a woman who hummed lullabies while preparing miso soup that no one ever ate. Even the doorknobs, cold to the touch, hummed with the memory of hands. Nothing here was lifeless. Everything remembered, and Hannah understood now her task was never about keeping the stories. It was about becoming the place where stories could rest. Not all endings needed to be grand. Some just needed to be allowed. She looked once more at the box, then turned down the hallway. Her feet carried her to the room at the end, the one where her mother used to sleep, the one that always smelled faintly of jasmine and cedar. She opened the door and stepped inside. The bed was already turned down. A robe hung neatly on the wall. A small mirror on the vanity reflected the candlelight, but nothing else. She lay down slowly, her body sinking into the memory-creased sheets. She did not expect sleep, but she closed her eyes anyway, and the house, grateful and watchful, exhaled with her. Night passed without boundary. There was no definitive shift from darkness into light, only a gradual softening, the way candlelight gives way to morning fog. When Hannah opened her eyes, the room was the same, yet subtly changed. The scent of jasmine was stronger, as though someone had walked through moments before. Outside, the frost had receded from the windows, leaving behind faint trails like fingers drawing invisible stories on the glass. She lay there for a while, listening, not for voices or movement, but for the quiet thrum of the house itself. It was no longer heavy, no longer burdened. It breathed with her slowly and evenly. She rose and dressed the robe, wrapping around her like a second skin, carrying with it the weight of those who wore it before. In the hallway, the lanterns were already lit, though she had no memory of lighting them. The scrolls and books were gone, not missing, but simply no longer necessary. In their place stood a single wooden stand, upon which rested a new ledger, bound in midnight blue cloth, its pages untouched. She knew what it was. Not a diary, not a journal. A guest book. The inn was ready. Downstairs, the teapot was warm. Steam curled from the spout, the scent of roasted barley drifting into the stillness like an old lullaby. Hannah poured herself a cup and stepped out onto the porch. The snow had melted into thin streams that curved down the hill like veins of silver. The trees, once stark and skeletal, now bore early buds. Change had come quietly, respectfully, like an old friend not wanting to interrupt. And then she saw her, a girl standing at the edge of the path. She couldn't have been older than 10. Hair in twin braids, a travel-worn satchel at her side. Her coat oversized the sleeves falling past her hands, but her eyes, sharp searching, older than they should have been. She stood frozen, one foot poised to retreat, the other stubbornly rooted in curiosity. Hannah raised her hand gently, not waving, just acknowledging. The girl didn't move at first. Then slowly she stepped forward, one foot, then another, crunching softly on the gravel path up toward the porch. She stopped a few feet away, looking past Hannah and toward the open door. "Is this the place?" she asked, her voice careful, quiet. Hannah nodded. Yes. The girl looked down, her fingers clutching the strap of her satchel. "I had a dream about it. A woman told me I'd find something here. I think her name was Aiko." The name hit softly like a breeze passing through reeds. Hannah smiled, a mixture of surprise and recognition. She stepped aside. "Come in then. You're right on time." The girl hesitated, then crossed the threshold. Inside, the house welcomed her, not with noise or movement or even light, but with warmth. A sense that it had been waiting not just for any guest, but for this one in particular. Hannah followed her in and gently closed the door behind them. There was no ceremony, no ritual, just the sound of footsteps moving through rooms long uninhabited, now waking gently from sleep. Later, Hannah would show her the ledger. Later still, they would sit by the fire, and the girl would speak her story, not all at once, but in pieces, like petals dropped on water. For now, they walked the halls together, the girl stopping occasionally to touch the walls, to peer into rooms that seemed to shift as she looked at them. And Hannah, no longer alone, felt the circle closing, only to open again as it always had, as it always would. This was the way of the inn, not to hold on to stories forever, but to offer them a place to rest. The fire burned low, crackling softly in the hearth as dusk folded itself into the rafters. The girl sat cross-legged on the tatami mat, her satchel open before her, spilling out a mess of folded papers, a stuffed rabbit missing an ear, and a crumpled photo too faded to make out the faces. Hannah knelt nearby, letting the silence work between them, not as distance, but as space for what needed to emerge. The girl had said little since her arrival, but the house did not press. It never had. It waited with the patience of something eternal. Eventually, the girl held up a page. It looked like a letter hastily written in blue ink. "I wrote this when I was scared," she said, "but I didn't know who to send it to. My mom says you can't mail things to the past." Her voice didn't waver, but her fingers did. Hannah took the letter gently, not to read it, but to hold it. "The past listens in other ways," she said. They placed the letter inside the ledger, not as an entry, but as a beginning. And in that moment, the wind outside shifted. Not a storm, a breeze, a promise. The house gave a subtle creak, as if exhaling approval. Later that night, Hannah prepared the futon in the guest room. The girl watched with quiet eyes, her stuffed rabbit now tucked beneath one arm. "Why is this house here?" she asked finally. "Why does it wait in the woods?" Hannah pulled the covers up to the girl's chin. "Because sometimes the world gives us places to pause, not to forget, but to understand. And what happens when we're done? Then we walk out the door. But we don't leave empty." The girl blinked slowly, her eyelids heavy now. "Will I remember this?" "If you need to," Hannah replied. You'll remember just enough. The room dimmed. Outside, the moon climbed high, casting pale light across the frost-glazed windows. Hannah sat in the hallway for a long time afterward, the new ledger resting on her knees. She did not write in it. She simply let her fingers brush its cover, feeling the texture of the cloth, the faint warmth it had absorbed. There would be other guests. Some would arrive with questions, others with silence. Some would leave stories behind, others would only borrow space to breathe. The house would continue, as it always had, not a destination, but a turning point hidden in the woods. And Hannah, its keeper, its witness, would continue to greet them not with answers, but with presence. When morning came, she would light the kettle and place 2 cups on the table, not knowing if both would be used, but always hoping they might, because the inn was no longer haunted. It was inhabited, not by ghosts, but by memory, by mercy, by the quiet insistence that even the lost deserve a soft place to land. And so the story of Yamashiro Inn closed not with an ending, but with a breath. A final hush before the next footstep echoed down the snowy path. And now, as the embers settle into ash and the lanterns dim one by one, I invite you to slowly return from the quiet corners of the Yamashiro Inn. Let your breath match the stillness, soft and steady. Let your thoughts settle like snow, each one a feather-light flake that vanishes the moment it lands. This journey wasn't meant to frighten you. It was meant to carry you gently through a different world, one where silence is sacred, and stories don't scream, they whisper. Perhaps you saw something of yourself in Hannah, in the guests who never truly leave, or in the little girl who found a door she didn't know she was searching for. That's the beauty of stories like this. They don't tell you what to feel. They simply offer the space to feel it. So as you close your eyes tonight, may you drift through soft corridors and gentle snowfalls. May your thoughts wander down quiet hallways where everything remembers you kindly. And if in your sleep you find yourself standing before a gate hidden in the woods, don't be afraid. Just step through, because every soul deserves a story. Every story deserves a place to rest, and every ending is just another beginning.